This meeting is being recorded.
Hey everybody, it's Mike Young from aPlantBasedDiet.org with my second video with Dr. Peter Rogers. I'm excited for this. Just to give you a quick intro in case you're not familiar with him. I'll tell you right away, he's very direct, which is a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I don't like to waste time on small talk. He is self-described as two things: the bad boy of veganism, I've heard in one of his recent videos, and also the best doctor in the world, both of which I would say are probably accurate descriptions. You'll find out by watching this. And the topic for today is how to become smarter instead of stupider, dementia theories. So these are the theories of dementia for Dr. Peter Rogers, and expect a lot of truth bombs here. That's how I would describe also the efficient conveyance of information that's going to take place here. So welcome, Dr. Rogers.
Hi, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, so why don't you go ahead and get right into the subject. I'm sure everybody out here watching this video probably knows somebody who's affected by dementia. So this is very, very relevant.
Yeah, and also when we say the word dementia, we're typically referring to, an older person who's lost their way and needs somebody to take care of them 24/7. But what I'm also going to say is the vast majority of America, by the time they're 60, they're fat, sick, and stupid. Okay, so this isn't just like a problem for 80-year-old grandma who's sick. This is a problem that most Americans run into by the time they're 60, if not sooner. They've lost their vitality, their zip, their nuance, their ability to have subtle thought.
Okay,
and
Dr. Rogers, you are 60, is that right?
Yeah, I'm 60 years old. I have zero medical problems.
Okay, just want to make sure people know that. So you're practicing what you preach.
Oh yeah, exactly. I do everything I'm telling you about. I do it. I've lived it. I've been very interested in cognitive optimization for a long time. And then I worked as a neuroradiologist. I am a neuroradiologist, one of the main things I do. So I see cognitively impaired, demented people all day long, every day. And I also, though, do a lot of other things. I was an imaging-guided surgeon. I do a lot of biopsies, and I talk to my patients because I have a lot of doctor friends. And, my doctor friends tell me, they say every single one of their patients, 60 and older, is cognitively impaired. They're all mentally slow. Sort of like they can find their way home, but they really can't handle any type of sophisticated conversation. So it's super common, cognitive impairment.
All right, so would you describe this as kind of like a downward spiral that's almost expected these days?
Yes, I would say that it's considered normal now. Oh, I'm having a senior moment, Like I said, fat, sick, and stupid has become normal for late 50s and early 60s. And right, it doesn't have to be that way.
I'm 54, so I'm getting in the mid-50s. I'll be 55 in February. And I don't want any of this. But unfortunately, it seems like, like you said, a lot of people have this problem. But is it modifiable? I guess that's what.
Oh, it's totally preventable. It's totally preventable. Okay. You got people, the old Okinawans before they brought all the fast food in there, they're 105 doing push-ups and stuff, still able to work and all this. So all this stuff, we get the westernized view is, the westernized diet makes people sick, but doesn't have to be this way at all. Back, the old story is McDougall when he was working in Hawaii in the 1970s. The plantation workers from the Philippines, those guys would retire at 65, keep their pension, go back to the Philippines, get a young bride in their 20s, raise a whole other family, and with no Viagra, okay? Yeah. So that's like normal function on a plant-based diet.
So that's almost like having two lifetimes in a way.
Yeah, that whole phase is fun with the kids, when they're young. I enjoyed those days.
Yes. All right, well, that's awesome. So that you're giving hope too. You're optimistic. You're giving hope in a culture that doesn't share that right now, unfortunately.
Yeah. I'll talk about all this stuff. I think there's good reason to be hopeful, but you have to actually do what you're supposed to do for health. It's the individual's choice. They can do what they want. People tell me, "Oh, I'd rather die than stop eating meat." And I'm like, well, guess what's coming, pal?
Yeah, it's a miserable downward spiral, like we were talking about.
Oh yeah, and then conventional medicine is basically a joke. Conventional medicine, it's honest about what a joke it is, but people are too stupid to realize that. For example, they call diabetes, hypertension, obesity, coronary artery disease, impotence, chronic diseases. You know why they call them chronic? Because they can never cure them. Zero. The cure rate is zero, and there's an obvious reason for that. These are dietary diseases, and the cure rate for a dietary disease with a pill is zero. And so that's why I think it's funny that conventional medicine calls itself the standard of care, the gold standard of care. It's a big joke. These patients are cured all the time with a plant-based diet.
It's good and bad to hear that. But along with that, do you think that most of these dietary diseases or most medical problems are the result of incorrect diet?
Yeah, I do. And, McDougall used to say 75%. T. Colin Campbell would say 75, 80%. And I would agree with that. That's most of it, because the way I see it, how they used to say marijuana is the gateway drug to becoming a drug addict and a low-life screw-up. Okay, well, the way it works for health, it's obesity, diabetes, and hypertension. Those are the gateway diseases, especially obesity and hypertension. And it's easy to prevent it. And once you prevent that, pretty much what you do to prevent hypertension is about what you do to prevent diabetes. And once you do that, you don't go down this path of kidney failure, spine failure, brain failure, heart failure, versus if you do go down that path like the typical chump, it's inevitable you're going to have problems in one of those areas.
All right. So would you agree with a statement I've heard that says that when the body heals, it doesn't just heal one thing, it heals everything?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And what I mean by that is the way students are taught in medical school is this is disease number 1, here's drug number 1. This is disease number 2, here's drug number 2. Disease number 3, drug number 3. It's basically they're trained how to sell drugs.
Right.
They're trained to be a dealer instead of be a healer. And then what I would phrase as a good way to think about health is like this joke from the movie Colors, okay? There was 2 bulls up on a hill. There's a young bull and an older bull. And the young bull says to the older bull, hey, look down there. A whole bunch of cows down there grazing in the valley. You want to run down there and screw one of those cows? The old bull says, why don't we walk down there and screw all of them? Okay, so the point is, if you just get your act together, you cure most of these diseases simultaneously. So why not do that?
All right,
There's no side effects to improving your diet and your lifestyle and your habits.
All right, so the test is when you go to your annual checkup that you don't have any of these diseases, but the homework is all these habits you're going to tell us, right?
Yeah, I would also say the test is that you skip the annual checkup. You don't need it.
Okay, that's even
True.
all right.
Yeah, I don't want somebody poking around at me. They're going to feel something or get some idea and all of a sudden send me for something expensive and painful. No, I'm fine. I don't want anybody touching my thyroid. They'll send me for a thyroid ultrasound. There'll be an asymptomatic nodule. All of a sudden I'm getting a biopsy. No, I think I'm okay.
Yeah, I hear you. And you're a radiologist, so you have the credentials to comment on that.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of things like that. What people don't understand is conventional medicine is a business. And goal number 1 of the business is to sell drugs. Goal number 2 is to sell other stuff. Sell blood tests, sell imaging tests, invasive procedures, and to sell surgeries. That is how money is made. And patients are really irrelevant. What patients don't understand, because most of them are gullible chumps, they don't understand is that no one cares about them. No one even pays attention to them. As long as a doctor follows the standard of care and meets the requirements for the billing code, they get paid. And because they follow the standard of care, they cannot be sued. It doesn't matter if the patient dies. There's no such thing as a hospital that I'm aware of in the Western world that actually tracks outcomes on any type of large scale. And here's what's funny about it. If you had a sports team, and the sports team, what does a sports team do? They talk about their record. We had a great record last year. We won the championship. Okay. In conventional medicine, what they say is we lose all the time. We lose every single game. We're the best. It's ridiculous. And they will never track outcomes, because if they did, let's say they tracked outcomes for diabetes or hypertension or coronary artery disease, somebody would just come along with a low-fat vegan diet and have 1,000 times better results. So they can never go there, and they never will. Instead, they always talk about productivity, efficiency. Well, last year we performed 200 pancreas surgeries. We're an expert institution for pancreas surgery. They never answer the question, well, why were you doing so many pancreas surgery? There's no reason to operate that much. There's not that many pancreas cancers. You must be operating on a lot of patients that don't really have cancer. Okay. Anyway, that sort of thing.
I've heard you also say that a lot of what you see as a practicing medical doctor is a lot of people showing up at these facilities, these hospitals, and being wowed with all the architecture and high-tech equipment and everything else, right? Which probably has nothing to do with health at all, right?
Yeah, I think that's how it is. It used to be, if you go back in time about 1,000 years ago, or maybe 700 years ago, that was sort of, the cathedral was the most magnificent building in the whole country. Okay. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, isn't this beautiful? A tribute to God. Okay. And what I'm trying to say is, in the modern world, people think that science is like God, something that's always correct, infallible, and the ultimate that man could aspire to. But I laugh at it because it's a big joke. A hospital is a business, okay? It is a business designed to make money off the people that walk in the door by selling them drugs and these other things. And so that patient walks in there thinking, oh, I'm so lucky to have all this industrial sophistication here to help save me. And meanwhile, the hospital's like, look, pal, we're going to sell you a bunch of stuff. If you get better, good for you.
All right. So this business of, let's say, dementia, the information you're going to give us here today may really hurt that business of
well, the way medicine is run, it's run by billionaires, okay, and it's set up so they keep making billions of dollars. All right,
yes,
there's zero hope of reform. I'm not a reformer. I don't believe in reform because I know it's impossible. I know the medical side. I've been a doctor over 30 years. I'm from a family of doctors. You can't change anything about the healthcare system. It is designed to be the way it is because that's what's profitable.
right.
But what you can do as an individual is learn how to keep yourself healthy. And so that's worth doing. I sort of figure that this is really only tailored to a very small audience. The number of people that have the curiosity, the energy, and the interest to learn all this stuff are very few. But, it's nice to try to keep them healthy.
Yes, well, that's our audience. I mean, we're really into health span and longevity, so we want people who are open-minded enough and willing to do the work to take control of their habits and their health. So yeah, you've got the right people. So why don't you go ahead and get into it?
Okay.
Show us your presentation.
Okay. Can you see my slide?
Not yet.
Oh yeah, I got to share. Let me share my screen here. Can you see my slides now?
I see me on the screen. You're sharing. There we go. I see it.
Okay, so here's the first slide. It's a comparison of plant foods and meat. When I say plant foods, I mean low-fat organic plant foods. Everything in green is good. Everything in red is bad. This is why I always laugh when people try to talk about paleo, keto, carnivore, low carb. It's just idiotic. Okay, plants have the good stuff. If you want to keep anything healthy in your body, you need good blood flow. Good blood flow, better blood flow, the better the healing, the better the health. Fiber prevents leaky gut, helps prevent autoimmune disease. It also prevents amyloid-type clotting from leaky gut. Potassium, magnesium are vasodilators. They open up arteries. Nitrates are the precursors to systemic nitric oxide vasodilator. Plants have the antioxidants. It's because if you're out in the sun, it's 100 degrees out, an animal like a human, we go walk on a tree to get in the shade. The plant has to stand there in the hot sun all day, 100 degrees or more.
Right.
And it has to protect itself with antioxidants. You eat the plant, you get the antioxidants, and they prevent oxidative stress in your body. Complex carbohydrates are the fuel that the body's designed to run on, primarily from starch, but fruits are also a good source. Okay, here's meat. The only thing meat has going for it that's good is vitamin B12. Besides that, it's just full of problems. High saturated fat, it's obesogenic, diabetogenic, and it causes tissue hypoxia. Animal protein, more leucine methionine, activates mTOR, mammalian targeted rapamycin, accelerates the rate of cell growth. It induces a little bit of an anabolic phase that increases cholesterol. It's like a contractor getting ready to build. It's waiting on leucine and methionine amino acids. So when these become abundantly available, as they are with animal protein, the cells replicate at a faster rate, which accelerates aging and accelerates cancer growth. T. Colin Campbell in his book China Study said, the number one most powerful thing in the world to cause cancer is casein, the milk protein, and other animal protein is also carcinogenic. Okay, so that's the reason why the older you get, man, you want to minimize it, and I recommend 100% avoid it. There is no 0 point threshold other than none at all to minimize risk of cancer as far as animal protein is concerned. They eat high on the food chain. Yep.
I have a question on that. You mentioned about speeding up cell growth rate. I think I've heard you mention also that cells only have so many, I don't know, like 6 times or something, divisions or something.
Yeah. You're talking about the Hayflick limit. A cell has a limited number of times it can divide. And so a typical cell, a cell of your body, they call them somatic cells. So that's non-germ cells, for example, and non-stem cells. And basically, once they hit their limit, about 60 cell divisions, they just go into what's called senescence and they die. What this is all about is you have things at the end of your chromosomes called telomeres. They're like little plastic caps on your shoelaces. And every time the cell replicates, the DNA polymerase can't get all the way to the end of the chromosome. So the chromosome shortens a little bit. It can't replicate the tips. And eventually you start shortening those chromosomes into genes that are essential for cell function and life. So you just die. Okay, the cell just dies, and when that happens on a widespread basis, the person dies.
So
what
end
I'm
of
saying is,
lifespan, right? So that's accelerating you to get up to that end of lifespan, which you don't want.
right. You accelerate the rate at which you reach the Hayflick limit. Hayflick was a molecular biologist working with human tissue cultures, and he figured that out.
Okay.
Yeah. So AGEs, advanced glycation end products, and there's ones that come from food itself. We call those exogenous. There's ones that come from your body, like when you have diabetes, and they go around damaging tissue. They're kind of like sticky things that distort the shape of proteins. Arachidonic acid is found in animal foods, like let's say chicken and eggs in high amounts. Plants don't have that. Estrogenics, they fatten up the animal. It's like a fat storage hormone, estrogen. When a woman's pregnant, it goes up quite a bit to get her to store more weight because the baby might need that for calories. So when a person is exposed to a lot of estrogenic chemicals for multiple reasons, they give them to the cattle animals, for example, to fatten them up faster. Well, they make us fatter too. Heme iron is much higher in animal foods, especially like red meat, for example. It can be an oxidant. It can be an autocatalytic in the blood to be prothrombotic, cause clotting. It increases the risk of cancer, like for colon cancer, et cetera. It increases the risk for neurodegeneration. Anyways, meat tends to be associated with high sodium, both to flavor it and to preserve it. It's low in magnesium and potassium, the vasodilators. It's often fried. You get things from these beef animals, for example, called xenosialitis. The sialic acid components of the glycoproteins are different. They're only a tiny bit different, such that our body is tricked into putting them into our own cells, but the immune system is still sophisticated enough to recognize them. So bottom line is it's a way to cause autoimmune disease. Wow. Viruses like bovine leukemia virus, heterocyclic amines, trimethylamine oxide. There's no fiber at all in animal foods. And then even the things that people think are good aren't really good. Like people say, oh, well, I need fish to get my omega-3s. Yeah, right. It's immunosuppressant, increases your risk of prostate cancer, obesity, and diabetes. Okay, I just included some new stuff that I thought was kind of fun that a lot of people aren't aware of. A lot of young guys take way too much of these protein supplements. I recommend never taking these things. This is just Consumer Reports article from 2018. They routinely find heavy metal contaminants in here: arsenic, lead, mercury, cadmium. All these things can cause cognitive impairment, especially the lead and the mercury. So my advice is don't ever take. And with a powder, they can easily put stuff into a powder. Imagine that you were selling a powder. If you grind up a little lead, it's real heavy. The powder weighs more. You can sell it for more money. Here's another Consumer Reports article that chocolate routinely has heavy metals in it, and especially the dark chocolate. Again, I think that's funny because there's a lot of people who try to claim that cocoa, cacao, and dark chocolate are good for you. Yeah, right. BS.
Yeah, let me mention I know that one of the things that you tend to focus on is caffeine or caffeine-like substances, which are found in chocolate, right? As not being.
Yeah. Caffeine's a big joke. Okay. You're going to hear all these people tell you, oh, coffee is good for you. Yeah, right. It raises the same hormones as psychological stress. It increases cortisol and catecholamines. Cortisol increases glutamate transmission in your brain synapses, including your hippocampus, your memory center. Okay. Anything that increases the risk of those neurons dying from excitotoxicity. So that's why I'm saying it's so stupid. Somebody says, oh, I'm so tired, I have to have a cup of coffee. Well, the coffee is worth it if you have to drive home in traffic. But if you're just routinely eating coffee, all you're doing is giving yourself a brain stimulant, increasing the risk that those neurons are going to die. I'll explain why, but it's not a smart thing to do. And then you'll say, well, I heard the sleep experts say that coffee was okay. Well, you know why he says that? Because if he criticizes coffee, he won't get interviewed on any of the well-known channels on the internet, the YouTube channels or the other big channels. I'm telling you, that's how the internet works.
Yeah, I get you. And actually, let me add something else on there. My own observation is that so many people take caffeine every day, right? It's usually a pattern of caffeine in the morning hours and alcohol at night. And anybody who goes against that, they lose such a large percentage of a potential audience, right? I mean, just that right. Affects somebody.
Yeah, because a lot of people told me that I should shut up. I shouldn't criticize commercial products. I'm like, look, I don't care. I'm not in this to be the most popular. I'll never be that more popular. But that's why I believe I'm the best doctor on the internet, because I'm not trying to be popular. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm just trying to be the best, which means I have to tell the truth. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, the truth. I think it's very important, and I appreciate that you do that.
Thanks. So here's another interesting book. This is called Food Forensics. And this guy, they tested with his lab the amount of contaminants in all these different foods. Plus, here it is from Consumer Reports. So what I think is funny is you'll have lots of people saying, oh, turmeric is such a great spice and it has all these health benefits, blah, blah, blah. And what I'm laughing is half of the turmeric specimens were contaminated with lead when Consumer Reports tested them. This is a recent article from 2021. And it's the same old story. When you sell something as a powder, people profit if they grind up lead and mix it in there, like lead chromate. It has the same color. So they mix it in there to sell it for more. And it's like, how do you know if it has lead or not? There are ways you could test it, but that's kind of a a pain in the butt to have to test it.
Okay, I
Okay,
have a
lead.
question related to this. Are you basically saying that any kind of isolate, because you mentioned protein, you're mentioning chocolate or cacao is processed, and so this is processed obviously, and isolate is the least desirable form of anything, right?
Yeah, I try to avoid it. I don't eat anything that's sort of like isolated. I only eat foods with one ingredients and whole foods. And especially these powders, I would never eat one of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another article about all the lead and in these turmerics. And here's what's funny. They tested a whole bunch of other things. Look at this. Ginger, every single case was contaminated with heavy metal. Oregano, every single specimen. Thyme, every single specimen contaminated. So that's why I'm not that big a fan. I'm kind of lazy, and people sometimes give me a hard time about that. Oh, you're so lazy, you're so simple. And I'm just like, well, it works for me, okay? And, you have to put a lot of effort into making sure if you're going to use these spices and stuff. And don't get me wrong, it might be fine to use them. Just make sure you make that effort to make sure the one you're using is a good one.
Yeah,
okay, cinnamon.
And I will tell you, I don't know anybody who makes that effort. So
exactly. So they don't know what they're eating. Like, look at this. They did the same thing with the cinnamon. So if you buy the cinnamon stick, that would be better because it's less likely that anybody's going to mess with it. They could potentially spray something on it, but that's still not going to be as bad as grinding up lead and putting it in there. So they were doing that again because it's sold based on weight. They make more money. One thing that's important to understand is a little bit about cholesterol, about cortisol. Cortisol is the hormone of stress. It is the hormone that basically, during an acute stress response, you need to basically, we call it being chased by a tiger in the dark. You need to give maximum physical effort for the next 30 minutes to an hour. So it cranks up your blood glucose level. It causes diabetes if it's chronically elevated. It cranks up your blood lipids, so it's atherogenic if it's chronically elevated. It perks you up, wakes you up. You got to be alert when you're running from a tiger. So you're going to have insomnia if it stays up at nighttime. It raises your blood pressure. You need a higher blood pressure and a bigger blood volume. So it increases sodium reabsorption from the kidneys if you're going to be able to maintain fast running or climbing, whatever, for that moment of acute stress. So basically, when you're running from a tiger, you don't care about your immune system. You don't care about preventing cancer. You don't care about anything except surviving the next 30 minutes. So everything else of secondary long-term issue is shut down. It shuts off your immune system. It actually lets your bones become osteoporotic, decreases blood flow to the gut, and causes leaky gut. So what I'm saying is, if you're being chased by a tiger, fine, run and climb a tree, do what you got to do. But you don't want chronic high cortisol. We're going to see a lot of things cause chronic high cortisol. Here's what it does in the brain. The cortisol binds to the...
I have one question about this because it's something I've experienced recently. I talked to a lot of different people in our line of work here with the nonprofit, and a lot of people, specifically women, tell me, hey, my doctor says my blood pressure is too low, so I need to take something that's going to jack it up, like something that's going to create that cortisol response, I suppose. Can you comment on that?
Well, I would say it depends how they feel. A lot of women have a pretty low blood pressure, and I would take that as a blessing. If they feel reasonably good like they always do, then that would be a good thing. In general, the lower the blood pressure, the better, as long as you feel good. Okay, right. If your blood pressure is low, it could be a sign that you're healthy. In these hunter-gatherer tribes where they eat primarily plant-based diets like the Yanomamo and stuff, they have the same blood pressure as a baby as they do when they're 75 years of age. So they can be born at about 90/60 and live their whole life around 90/60. And some of them will go up to about 110/70, which is still a very good blood pressure for an older person. Okay. So what I'm saying is, if they feel good, it's good.
Okay, that's good, because I hear a lot of people saying, well, my doctor said, I got to add more salt into my diet, for instance. And I guess caffeine will be another way to boost that up, right? I mean,
yeah, I would, that to me, unless if they're symptomatic, they're passing out or something, then there's something else wrong with them and they need to, get that figured out by their doctor. But okay, if they feel good and it's simply because their pressure is low when it's measured, I wouldn't take that too seriously if that's all it is.
Yeah, I hear you, because almost everybody is too high, right? That's what I see anyway.
Yeah, and the women are protected because of menstruation. When they menstruate, they lose red blood cells, and that lowers their hematocrit, meaning the amount of red blood cells in their blood. Well, the thinner the blood, that means the less thick it is, the less red blood cells are in it, because the blood cells are like over 99% of the cells in the blood. So when you lower that hematocrit, measure the amount of red blood cells, you lower the blood pressure. And hypertension is the main risk factor for atherosclerosis. So what I'm saying is, women who are chronically had lower hematocrits than men because of their menstruation, they have lower blood pressures, and therefore they get less atherosclerosis. It protects them. That's why women tend to be about 10 years ahead of men in terms of their internal aging.
Right.
And they tend to live overall about 5 years longer than men. It starts catching up with them. A lot of women have bad habits. They're kind of spoiled. They get away with bad habits when they're young because of their menstruation. But then when they're postmenopausal, they keep those same bad habits and they get into problems. Also, if they get a hysterectomy at a young age before 35, they end up with lots of problems.
Mhm.
Like whenever I see a demented female, like about, let's say, 55 to 65 or something, I always, first of all, I look for the usual suspects. Is she a smoker? Is she a drinker? Is she a drug addict? That sort of thing. And when it's not one of those, the next thing I always do is I look in her surgical record and see if she had a hysterectomy at a young age. And that's what it usually is. Because if they have a hysterectomy, they're not menstruating. So they basically are like a man in terms of their blood physiology.
Yeah.
But, none of her girlfriends has problems with coronary artery disease or impotence or anything. So they'll often eat really lousy diets and have severe hypertension or other vascular problems. And all of a sudden, they're having all these strokes and they're demented in their 50s or early 60s. Yeah, hysterectomy is a big deal. Oops, I meant to just say a few words on this slide here.
Yes.
Cortisol binds to the axon terminal of a neuron, and it causes the glutamate stored here in neurotransmitter vesicles, that this vesicle then travels to the plasma membrane of the synaptic cleft. Here's a synaptic cleft between the pre and the postsynaptic neurons. The glucose is then released into the synaptic cleft. It's called exocytosis. The glutamate binds to postsynaptic receptors, and it activates the postsynaptic neuron. And that's standard excitatory, meaning stimulatory neurotransmission in the brain. This is how brain cells talk to each other. So cortisol will increase that. The other thing that'll increase that is anything that opens up this voltage-gated calcium channel. Okay, and that's another reason why you don't want to hold your cell phone next to your head, because that opens up this voltage-gated channel. You should use a speakerphone. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes it's important and you can do it a little bit, but you don't want to do it as a habit. Okay,
I agree with that. I didn't know the science or the explanation here, the physiology, but I have done that as well, just because I didn't want to stick some radioactive thing broadcasting next to my brain if I don't need to.
Yeah. Whenever possible, speakerphone is preferable. Okay, here's what the food companies do. They want to get everybody addicted to their junk food, so they try to create what's called the bliss point. They bring in lots of study subjects, and they do research on them. They titrate the amount of salt, the amount of monosodium glutamate. MFG means manufacturer-free glutamate. All that matters is the glutamate. It's a flavorant. The amount of fat, is it fried? The amount of high fructose corn syrup, for example, until they find where the audience just loves it. And that's their addiction bliss point. This was a good book, Fat, Stressed, and Sick, by this lady, Catherine Reed. She was a protein biochemist whose daughter had autism. So she was sort of the perfect person to study MSG, a protein product. And she figured out that that was what was causing autism in her daughter, that and MFG, manufactured-free glutamate. So she spent a long time studying how do you get that out of the kid's diet. And her kid came back to normal. There's videos of it. She has a big TED Talk on it.
Is that common that someone can modify autism like that?
Well, I think autism is multifactorial. I know it is. So she was fortunate that her kid seemed most responsive to avoiding the glutamate. I would also say it appears that GP, glycine phosphate, that's what they spray on the GMO soy.
Right.
That also is associated with it. There's a lady by the name of Stephanie Seneff who's given a bunch of lectures about that. She wrote an entire book on the subject called Toxic Legacy.
Yep.
So basically, let's say I was trying to help a kid with autism. I would not allow them to have any MFG or MSG. None, zero. That'd be number one. Number two, I would not allow them to have any glyphosate. None, zero.
So fully organic foods then, right?
Yeah, I would also make sure they ate 100% organic diet, okay, of whole foods. And I would avoid anything that caused leaky gut. I would avoid other things that tend to be contaminated with heavy metals. Those are, things I would do. And then the things I'm going to talk about in this talk, too, they're going to be related as well.
Okay.
I have a very brain protective approach.
All right. I wanted to mention along with that, something that's associated with that, again, my own thought, not knowing a lot of this physiology that you understand. But I, lived through the 90s, and yeah, autism took a spike after they introduced glyphosate and Roundup Ready crops widely in the 90s. So I've always thought that there was some type of connection there. Yeah,
it's not good. And I wouldn't be surprised if omega-6 cooking oils contribute too. It's multifactorial because those things can cause significant brain damage as well. Here is an example of a protein that has a lot of glutamates. That's what the G is for glutamate. And the more you process it, the more you will chop this protein. So a regular protein is like a necklace of amino acids. The amino acids are like the beads on the necklace, and these are the bonds connecting them. So when you process it, you break up these connections, and now the glutamate becomes free. That's why it's called MFG, manufactured free glutamate. And these individual glutamate residues will bind with taste receptors in our mouth, our throat, and the rest of our intestinal tract because our ancestors worried about starving every day. So if they found a foodstuff that had a lot of protein in it as signaled by this glutamate, they would want to return to that spot. So they get to release a reward neurotransmitter, then taste pleasure from this. So the food companies take advantage of that, and they pack tons of this stuff in there. But what they do is they overwhelm the intestinal tract's ability to sequester it, because normally the intestinal tract does not want this getting into the blood. It's a neurotransmitter. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It can start activating neurons all over the place. Not good. And it can get into the brain. Even if somebody has a fully formed, perfect blood-brain barrier, it doesn't matter, because there's areas in the brain that do not have blood-brain barrier. The circumventricular organs around the third ventricle, they're like chemosensors to sense chemicals. So they don't have a blood-brain barrier. It gets into those areas and can track into adjacent areas. And a lot of people have gaps in their blood-brain barrier. Here's an interesting book I read recently called Monosodium Glutamate Effect on Plasma Cortisol. So I thought this was pretty interesting. It's pretty significant research study that got made into a book. Okay, so what's the relevance of this book? What they found, and there's not just one paper, there's a whole bunch of papers. When a person ingests monosodium glutamate, it causes an elevation in plasma cortisol. So it elevates the stress hormone. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yes.
This processed food is creating a stress effect on the body. Not good. Oh, I thought I had a better picture of what it does. Well, I kind of showed you before. Well, you got my point, that it's going to increase glutamate transmission in your neurons of the brain. So it's going to stimulate them. That's a big deal. It also turns out that excessive dietary salt has an activation effect as well on the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system is the part of the nervous system that's the stress response. So to activate the sympathetic nervous system is to say to increase the stress response. So high dietary sodium does that. Okay, so again, what we're talking about here is, I would also use the word consilience. Consilience means that you have a bunch of individual things. Each one by itself seems kind of minor, but you look at them all together and they're quite significant. It's a little bit like the difference between deductive logic and inductive logic. So what am I talking about? Aristotle would say, for example, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So that is called deductive logic, where you have exact information. 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, fine. But in real life, we seldom have those situations. We have more of a situation, well, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, and this is bad, and this is bad. And if we did all 5 of those bad things together, we probably get a really bad result. Okay, that's the way to think of it. So what I'm saying is, there's a bunch of things that are increasing the cortisol in our blood, which is overactivating our brain cells, potentially causing them to die by excitotoxicity. So you want to avoid this stuff. Minimize your intake of MSG, MFG. Minimize your intake of dietary sodium. You can put a little sprinkling on your food, but don't be eating these processed foods that are jam-packed with it.
Dr. Rogers, I've heard word on the street is 1,500 milligrams. That's what you hear anyway, as a maximum daily intake of sodium. What is your thought? Do you have a number?
That's a pretty reasonable amount. Depending on what you read, you'll hear the average American's eating about 5,000, grams a day or something. It kind of depends how they measure it and what they go by. I think people are tending to eat a lot more than is widely said. And then there's also sort of like the McDougall perspective. What McDougall says is, he doesn't worry that much about sodium. He says the main poisons in the Western diet are the animal food and the oils. Okay, so he says if you just switch them over to eating plants, you get a big drop in sodium just for doing that, because plants are full of potassium and magnesium, the good stuff. They're intrinsically low in sodium. And he then says you can sprinkle a little salt on your food, because if you don't let people do that, they're not going to eat it. And I actually think that's all reasonable.
Well,
and then
McDougall's work started a long time ago. Back in the day, there weren't many plant-based junk foods like we see now. We see a lot more.
Right.
So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would never eat any of this processed junk food. I personally avoid all this stuff. I won't eat anything with more than one ingredient, because if it's one ingredient, it's a whole food. They can't put anything in it. As soon as you have a second ingredient, they can throw MSG in there and not tell you. They're not required to tell you. That's why I will never eat something with 2 ingredients. So basically, I just avoid all the bad stuff as much as I can. And you're going to also end up, we'll talk in a moment here about the potassium-sodium ratios. Every cell in our body has a whole bunch of these pumps. An average cell, let's say 1/3 of its energy goes to this pump. In a brain cell, it's anywhere from 1/2 to 2/3. And this is called the potassium-sodium ATP pump. And so what it does is it pumps sodium out of the cell. Na is for sodium. It means natrium. That's sodium in Latin. And K is for kalium. That's potassium in Latin. So it takes in 2 positive charges from the potassium, pumps out 3 positive charges for the sodium. And because you're pumping out more positive charge, that leads to a negative resting membrane potential. There's a negative charge along the inner surface of this membrane. And that's relevant because the positive charge is sitting out here. They're attracted to it. They want to come into the cell. And their desire to get into the cell can be harvested and coupled to other things like pumping out calcium. And that's super important in human cells. Another thing to notice is that magnesium is needed to run these ATP pumps. I'll show you. I think I got a picture of why magnesium is so important. Yeah, here it is. ATP means adenosine triphosphate. So 1, 2, 3 phosphates. The phosphates have a big honking negative charge, and they want to break away from each other. So the magnesium, with its 2 positive charges, it can kind of hold on to them. It's like holding on to a bucking bronco. So this phosphate's not released until necessary. ATP is the energy currency of the cell. It's like a $20 bill in a cell. And basically, magnesium is almost like, the guy in charge of the horses to make sure they do what they're supposed to do. And you need that magnesium. The vast majority of Americans are deficient in magnesium because they don't eat plant foods. So they have a hard time. They're not functioning at their optimal capacity because they can't run their ATP reactions that well. So here's a little bit more detail on how a cell works. So first of all, calcium is like the aristocrat of ions. Calcium comes into the cell. When it's elevated, it's like flipping on a light switch. And it says, go, go, go. And the cell does whatever it's supposed to do. So a brain cell, a neuron, will release its neurotransmitter when cytoplasm calcium becomes elevated. And the neuron has to be able to turn on and shut off very rapidly, like within a millisecond it's supposed to. A lot of these things in a cell, they happen incredibly fast. And what I'm saying here is the way that this cell pumps out calcium is it couples the gradient here produced by this pumping situation over here to letting sodium come in over here and simultaneously, like a rotating door, pumping calcium out. It's called the NACA exchanger, Na for sodium, Ka for calcium. Okay, so you really need these pumps working.
Yeah, you said it's super fast. It sounds like almost like a strobe light, that fast.
Yeah, it's incredibly fast. It can pump out thousands in a second.
Okay.
And what I'm also trying to say is, people, well, not that we need to get into all this stuff, but people say, why do I believe in God? Doesn't science make me not believe in God? No, science makes me believe in God more because I have a deep knowledge of it, okay? Can you imagine an engineer making a pump on a little tiny plasma membrane that can pump out 5,000 calcium in a second? It's incredible. It's like, it's so complex, so fast, so amazing. It's beyond what a human could even imagine, okay? And the life on Earth figured all this stuff out millions of years ago. Who knows how many years ago? Anyways, it's quite incredible. But you want to have a healthy diet, which means your normal person should be eating about 20 times as much potassium as sodium. Typical Americans eating about the opposite of that. Because if you eat a processed food diet and you eat meat preserved with sodium, you're going to eat tons of sodium, hardly any potassium. Whereas plants are full of potassium and low in sodium. So these pumps run better in a person eating a plant-based diet. And that's highly relevant because it helps protect these neurons and get them to function optimally. You always need ATP to pump out calcium because its concentration outside the cell in the extracellular matrix is about 15,000 times higher than it is inside the cell. So you're always pumping against a gradient. That's an important point. And there's a guy who wrote a real famous book, and it's a great book. His name was Richard Moore, MD, PhD. He spent his whole life researching ion pumps, and he came to the conclusion, at a minimum, people need to eat 5 times more potassium than sodium or they're screwed. And I would say you should probably eat at least 10 times more. And out of habit, I eat like at least 20 times more. But be aware of that because it's more the potassium factor. He calls it the K factor, meaning the ratio of potassium to sodium that determines whether or not you're going to be hypertensive. And being hypertensive to a significant amount is a big deal because it's the main risk factor for atherosclerosis and stroke.
All right. This thing about eating more magnesium than calcium, does anybody get taught this?
No, this is not taught. Doctors don't know anything about nutrition.
Right. Yeah.
It's simply not taught in med school. I always describe it as NETS. I call it NETS. N is for nutrition, E is for epidemiology, T for toxicology, and then S is for all the other stuff, spiritual, sleep, all that stuff, sedentary versus exercise. They learn a little bit about it, but not much. And they really don't know. That's why I say that med school is kind of fake. Pre-med education, med school, and residency are kind of fake because they never learn about the things that matter the most for the most common diseases. Stupid.
Yeah, because when I hear someone has something, I'm not in the medical industry, but I hear, well, and my first question is, well, why did that happen? Of course,
right.
The system doesn't look at it that way.
Right, and that's why I wrote that one book called The Medical Reformation. I basically rewrote all the internal medicine textbooks, and I rewrote all the neurology textbooks. And people say, well, how could you be so arrogant? How could you be so confident? I'll tell you, because it's obvious, all right? When you read the internal medicine textbook, here's what they say about all the chronic diseases. Well, it's associated with aging, and sometimes it's genetic, and sometimes it's due to infection, like a virus. And sometimes it seems to be associated with socioeconomic disparity. And that sounds, oh, isn't that thoughtful and wonderful? It's BS, okay? Why do I say it's BS? If you go back, let's say, to Africa, 1929, the Donaldson paper in the Lancet Journal, 1,800 consecutive hospital admissions. If you had 1,800 consecutive hospital admissions of black patients in the USA, what percentage of them will be hypertensive in the USA? It'd be at least 80% of them, something like that, okay? In Kenya, zero. Yeah. No one with hypertension. Zero. Okay. You go to China before 1970 when they ate the white rice, only 1% of calories from fat for about 90% of their calories. There's no such thing as a fat person. It's like zero obesity. Okay. The only fat guy I ever saw from China before then was Bolo in the Bruce Lee movies because he was taking steroids, you know, kind of eating the diet like a sumo wrestler with the animal foods in it. All right. So the point I'm making is people who eat these low-fat plant-based diets, they're skinny. They went to Africa before 1957. There was not a single case report even of rheumatoid arthritis, a very common autoimmune disease. So, you know, when they went to China before 1960, Roy Swank went there. He said they couldn't find a single patient with multiple sclerosis. It's a very common autoimmune disease. Right. So when people eat these low-fat plant-based diets, they don't get these diseases. They don't get hypertension. They don't get fat. They don't get diabetes. They don't get autoimmune disease. So it's rather incredible how well that all works.
Yeah, it's wonderful news. More people need to hear it.
Yeah. It's sort of like we're not designed to be sick. We're actually designed to be healthy. This is a picture of Rome. And as the old saying was, you know, all roads lead to Rome. And what I'm trying to say in the human brain cells, all roads lead to calcium. There's a whole bunch of things that increase calcium. And you don't want that to happen. So the smart move is if you're trying to maintain optimal brain health, you avoid all of these as best you can. It's easy to avoid excessive dietary salt. A little bit's not a big deal, but you want to avoid excessive amounts. There was a whole other topic of getting into threshold effects and the work of Kempner versus McDougall and Pritikin. We don't need to get into that, but the bottom line is when you get your sodium super low, that has a dramatic effect on blood pressure. When you're only in sort of the middle range, you know, like let's say between about 600 to 6,000, it's not as big of a deal, the effects. But I would still do it because even though it might not cause that big a change in your blood pressure to go down, let's say another 500 milligrams, it would cause a big effect potentially. It helps to lower your cortisol. It protects you in other ways. It helps to prevent hypertension. It helps also to improve cellular function, even if the change in your blood pressure is not that big. Because you'll hear some people say, oh, I would drop my sodium intake by 1,000 milligrams and my blood pressure didn't improve that much. It's still good to do it. That's a whole big subject. But what I'm trying to say is, the benefits are more than just the blood pressure effect is what I meant to say. Okay, you want to avoid traumatic brain injury. Like you don't want to be hitting a soccer ball with your head or doing any sport where you're getting head trauma. You want to avoid all these mitochondria inhibitors and SERCA inhibitors because they're important for pumping calcium out of the cell. If you can't pump calcium out of the cell, it will accumulate in your cytoplasm. Anyways, and then as far as things that will increase calcium in the cytoplasm directly from cortisol, stress, sleep deprivation, caffeine, excess dietary sodium, excess dietary glutamate. Okay. So, here's a little bit of how you pump it out. I showed you the knockout exchanges for pumping calcium out of the cell. It can also be pumped by the slower pump over here, plasma membrane calcium ATPase, and it can also be pumped into the endoplasmic reticulum here. It's called a SERCA. The S stands for sarcoplasm, which is really only relevant to the muscles, but they call it the SERCA pump. Sarcoplasm, endoplasmic reticulum, calcium ATPase. And the point is all of these things require ATP. So your mitochondria is where you make ATP. If your mitochondria don't work, then you can't run these pumps and you can't pump out the calcium, you're screwed. The neuron's going to end up dying, high risk to die from apoptosis. So this is just, again, the same slide showing the glutamate is released by the presynaptic neuron. goes across the synaptic cleft, binds with the postsynaptic neuron, and exerts an excitatory, stimulatory effect on it. The astrocytes help to recycle the glutamate. They take it out of the synapse, convert it to glutamine so you can transfer glutamine through the extracellular space, and then it's recycled into the presynaptic neuron. What I thought was interesting about the fact that glutamate increases cortisol is you can see a vicious cycle here. The dietary MSG, MFG is increasing cortisol. Cortisol is increasing brain neurotransmitter glutamate release in its synapses. And you can see how this keeps feeding the cycle, and you're going to end up with a bit of a vicious cycle. Increased glutamate causes increased cortisol. Increased cortisol causes increased glutamate. That's not good. So you got to break the cycle, avoid all this stuff so you don't keep cranking up your cortisol.
I got a question, Dr. Rogers. So it sounds to me like there's an out of balance condition that's creating that crank up of cortisol. And it's because you're eating things that are out of that natural balance of the whole plants that you were talking about. It seems like if you eat the whole plants, you're going to bring yourself back into an acceptable range.
Right. Yeah. Because there's only MSG and MSG in processed foods. There's none of this in a whole food. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's a big benefit. And caffeine is not your friend.
Yeah. Caffeine, usually people are drinking caffeine and fiberless beverages as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like people have been tricked into thinking it's their friend. It's got, it's $1 billion commercial food. It's got all this industry fake research to support it. But all you got to do is say, what does it do? There's a good book called Caffeine Blues. The author's name is Trinisky. I've made videos about it as well before. You're not going to make yourself healthier by increasing your blood cortisol and your blood catecholamines. Catecholamines are adrenaline and noradrenaline. So, and also, you'll hear somebody say, oh, caffeine and coffee is good for you. You go, yeah, right. How do you explain elevated cortisol and catecholamines being good for me? It's BS. It drops blood perfusion to the brain. What you do is you change the brain from being a frontal lobe thoughtful configuration, if you will, a good blood supply to the frontal lobes, and you sort of shift it into a mammal brain, a limbic mode, meaning just impulsive. One of the things people notice if they're sleep deprived and if they have a lot of caffeine on board as well and they're stressed out, they tend to be real snappy, snarky, impulsive, and rude. And it's a less thoughtful way of being. So it doesn't make you smarter. Because a lot of people think, oh, caffeine and, Ritalin, methylphenidate, and these other stimulants, you could take them in school and be smarter. That's absolute BS, okay? I knew the really smart guys. I was friends with a bunch of guys at Stanford. We're all getting A+, the most difficult classes and the best students. Not a single one of them took any drugs. Not one. Zero. Yeah. All that stuff is BS. It lowers your ability to concentrate. I know a guy who tutors a lot of students, both college prep and students having problems. And he says those stimulant drugs really decrease their ability to think in a sophisticated way.
That makes sense, Dr. Rogers. How about, is there any relation to like the ADD epidemic, it seems like, and also just certain people who tend to make bad decisions over and over again? You're right. I don't think that any people that I know like that have told me they don't take caffeine, that they, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that the whole, basically they're selling the equivalent of amphetamines to children. All right, I think that's insane. If you sold amphetamines on a street corner, that would be against the law. But now they're going to tell me a bunch of Ivy League, theoretically child psychiatrists are going to tell you it's good to give amphetamines to children. I think they're full of BS. I think the long-term results show that's very damaging to children. Robert Whitaker wrote an entire book about it, and other guys have written books about it related to that subject, like Bregan. It's ridiculous. What happens is the Ivy League and the other big-name medical centers, if they want to get grant money, if they want to get promoted, they need to publish papers. To publish papers, they need grant money. To get grant money, they have to make a deal with Big Pharma. And Big Pharma says, look, if you praise our drug, we'll give you money. If you don't help our drug, we won't give you anything. And if you criticize our drug, we'll get you fired. So all of those big name places, those guys are all a bunch of, butt kissers to Big Pharma because that's how they get their money. But they've sold out their patients. Okay.
Yeah. And just to kind of bring this full circle in a way, because I know ADD is probably a whole other video, but it almost to me sounds like if someone has a diagnosis of that, well, that's obvious because they're probably doing all these things wrong that you're saying that are messing with the cortisol, like you said. So the solution is to go back to whole foods, but I don't think that's usually given as medical advice when somebody.
Yeah, that's what I would do. I would fix everything that's fixable. There might have been some injury to the brain when the child was younger, maybe or maybe not, but you should fix everything that's fixable. The other thing too is, the whole grade school thing, in my opinion, is kind of crazy. It's not normal for any traditional population of humans for a child to sit in a room and then some stranger lady who he does not know talks about a bunch of things he doesn't care about all day long. And for little boys are hyper, so they have to sit in a chair 8 hours a day, listen to some lady they don't know talking about a bunch of nonsense. And then they have to memorize it for a test, and the whole thing is a joke and a waste of time. The reason I say that is, think about grade school and high school. How much can you remember from grade school and high school? Almost nothing. Most people I've talked to about, all I can remember is I learned how to type. That was valuable. And people sometimes have a few good experiences with some teacher that was nice to them, kind of their friend. I had an English teacher who was nice to me, and I appreciated that, and, got me interested in a few nice things in literature. That was good. But most grade school and high school education is primarily a waste of time, in my opinion. And you would get much better results educating people. There's certain things a person has to learn how to do. They have to learn how to read, for example. But if you let them read something they like, they do so much better than just forcing them to do stuff and then having a test on vocabulary where you're going to forget everything the next day. That's nonsense. There's a really good book. The author, I forget the author's name. The name of the book is called Book Whisperer. She was a 6th grade teacher. And she came to the conclusion that children need a little more autonomy in choosing what they read and study. So she just made a big library in her room. In a typical school, this is a 6th grade teacher, kids will read, about maybe 2 books a year, 3 at the most as a class, and everybody hates it. What she did is she just told the kids, you can read whatever you want, make a 5-minute book report. The average number of books read by her class, her students, was 43 books.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
These kids were reading 43 books a year.
Interested, right? It's something they want to do. Yeah. And I agree with what you're saying. The whole concept being that, like, when I went to school, elementary school for me was in the 70s, right? I mean, information was limited. It was very limited. Now you can find all this stuff easily conveyed through internet sources and things. And you can find anything you want, right? And if you're interested in it, you should go learn it.
Yeah, and because like when you pick the book yourself, it's a bit of an adventure. You have predictions about what you're going to find, and then you read it and you learn from that experience. It's a very enjoyable thing, and you're free, you're autonomous. So the kids like it, and her students were all the best students in the school. They were the best at everything. It doesn't matter what they read. Any kid that reads a lot will have a good vocabulary, will be good at learning other things, will be good at spelling, will be good at writing, and it just sort of feeds on itself. Plus, they learn in their mind's eye that when they encounter an intellectual problem, they can read their way out of the problem. So they develop that self-confidence.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Yeah, here's a synapse in the brain in more detail. So here's the glutamate neurotransmitter vesicles. The glutamate is released in the synaptic cleft. It diffuses across, binds to the postsynaptic neuron. And some of the things I want to show is here's the key receptor for glutamate. It's called the NMDA receptor. And it's primarily activated by glutamate, but it's also activated by glycine. And that's why that thing sprayed on soy, glycine phosphate, GP, it's very much like glycine. That will also activate the NMDA receptor. In addition, magnesium sits in the center of it normally and blocks it. The magnesium is attracted to the negative charge inside the cell because it's got a 2+ positive charge. So what this means is if a person is deficient in magnesium, some of their NMDA receptors will be open. There won't be a magnesium blocking this receptor. So these receptors will become hyperexcitable is the word, more prone to being open when they otherwise would not be. So they let more calcium into the postsynaptic neuron. That puts this postsynaptic neuron at increased risk for excitotoxicity, meaning overstimulation. Overstimulation, if it can't meet its metabolic demands, produce enough ATP to pump that calcium out, the neuron will eventually die. Okay. And I believe that's the main thing that's causing people to be cognitively impaired. Because I look at brains all the time. I've seen many thousands and thousands and thousands of brains for cognitive impairment, dementia, etc. And I don't tend to see the so-called Alzheimer's pattern. I think Alzheimer's is a big joke. I see diffuse cerebral atrophy. The whole brain is shrunken. Okay. Right. Other things that can activate the NMDA receptor are aspartame. The aspartate is an excitatory amino acid that can activate it.
Sweetener, right?
Yeah, that's the artificial sweetener, aspartame. Also beta amyloid protein. Now, when people talk about Alzheimer's, they talk about beta amyloid protein. And they sometimes call Alzheimer's as so-called type 3 diabetes. And here's what's going on. When you eat a high-fat diet, that causes insulin resistance. Insulin resistance causes the insulin not to work, so the pancreas produces more of it, and that'll increase blood levels of insulin. Then you have to clear the insulin out of the blood in the peripheral part of the body. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. The rest of the body is called the periphery. There's another enzyme called insulin-degrading enzyme, and that travels throughout the periphery and it removes insulin from the blood. However, it binds strongly to insulin, but it also is necessary. It's used to remove beta amyloid protein. What I'm saying is high-fat diets increase insulin, causing insulin resistance. Insulin-degrading enzyme clears that insulin out of the blood, but it's only able to be produced in small quantities, and it can't be ramped up significantly. What happens is then when it's tied up removing high levels of insulin, there's not enough insulin-degrading enzyme around to remove the BAP, the beta amyloid protein, and it moves from the periphery of the body into the brain, binds NMDA, and opens it up. So it becomes an excitotoxin. So what I'm trying to say is insulin resistance leads to neuronal excitotoxicity.
Okay. So
and also
what I've been hearing a lot is that that's the end game right there. But you're saying that's just a step in what's actually happened.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is this is one more step where you're messing with your brain cells. Mm-hmm. This doesn't happen in nature that people are eating 3 high-fat meals a day. There's no such thing.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question. You're talking about, it almost sounds like that a nutritional deficiency in magnesium is very much behind this whole process.
Yeah. Basically, the person is screwing up because they're not eating what they're supposed to. They're low in the good stuff, magnesium, which would block this receptor. Instead, they eat the high-fat meal, causing insulin resistance, leading to tying up all their insulin-degrading enzyme. So now you got BAP going back into the brain, beta amyloid protein, activating this receptor. Okay, and then they're also eating the glycine phosphate sprayed on their GMO food, and that's also making the NMDA receptor hyperexcitable. So it's letting more calcium into the postsynaptic neuron.
Okay, yeah. So it's all right. Well, this is I don't fully understand all of it yet, but it does seem to make sense what you're saying, the whole process, and I guess it's a process that I haven't heard this explained to anyone. I hope that more people will start to understand this.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm the best doctor in the world for understanding the brain, because I get right to the point. And you say to yourself, well, why does it matter? Okay, well, first of all, how could you avoid this? Well, glycine phosphate overactivation of the NMDA receptor. Just don't eat non-organic food, and it won't have any GP on it. Especially don't eat non-organic soy. And they spray it on a few other things. They'll even spray it on beans. They'll even spray it on oats if it's not organic. So that's how you avoid this glycine phosphate activation of NMDA receptor. Don't eat a high-fat diet. And then you'll have enough insulin-degrading enzyme to clear out your BAP. It's a non-issue. Don't drink aspartame sweetener.
Dr. Rogers, what defines a high-fat diet, in your opinion?
Well, to me, ideally, a diet should be about 10% fat or less. Definitely less than 15%.
Okay. When you say 10%, you mean 10% of the total calorie intake?
10% of total calories from fat, yeah. Okay. And don't get me wrong, up to 15, a lot of people say up to 15 is okay. Maybe, especially when you're young. But I like to try to make it lower than that. And if you just look at Kempner. He was feeding his patients about 2% fat, which is incredibly low. White rice is only 1% of calories from fat. And in China and Asia, back in the old days, before 1975, they were eating about 90% of their calories with white rice. Okay, that is only 1% of calories from fat. Sweet potatoes and regular potatoes also have only 1% of their calories from fat. You're not going to get any insulin resistance if your dietary fat is that low, right. And all your beta amyloid protein is going to be cleared out. It's a non-issue. You avoid the sweetener aspartame, then you avoid the aspartate. So this is pretty easy to avoid. Okay.
When you say aspartame, does any other artificial sweetener have a similar effect, or is it just that one?
That's the only one I'm aware of for being an excitotoxin to increase activation of calcium going into brain cells. They're all bad. But that's the only one that's an excitotoxin as far as I know. Yeah, like I know stevia increases infertility and the other ones all have major problems, but I don't recall at the moment all the details of it. Oh, here's a real simplification of my theory. It's called the Peter Rogers, MD, supply and demand theory of neurodegeneration, of dementia. So basically, every cell has OGD. OGD means oxygen and glucose delivery. You need to know that. Every cell has oxygen and glucose delivery. Oxygen is used by the mitochondria to make energy, ATP. Glucose is the substrate that is used. It's like the wood. If you're going to make a fire, you need to burn something. So glucose is what gets burned for energy in a cell. And oxygen is what's needed to burn it. Okay, then stimulants. Stimulants increase the metabolic rate of a neuron. We talked about how sodium increases cortisol. MSG, MFG increase glutamate transmission. Increasing the cortisol causes increased glutamate transmission in the neuron. Stress does the same thing. Caffeine, sleep deprivation. Okay, they're all going to increase glutamate transmission in those synapses in your brain cells. And we talked about aspartame opening up the NMDA receptor, glyphosate opening up the NMDA receptor, BAP, beta amyloid protein, being elevated and going back into the brain because of the high-fat diets. Okay, so that's all increasing the metabolic rate of the neuron. And then there's a whole bunch of things that inhibit mitochondria where ATP are produced, and you need that ATP to pump that calcium out of the cytoplasm. So basically, there's a whole bunch of things causing excessive cytoplasm calcium, which then overwhelms the cell because it ramps up the metabolic rate, but the cell can't make enough ATP to get that calcium out of the cytoplasm. It basically works itself to death and it dies. It's like having your brain cells being on triple shifts every day, and eventually a couple months or years of that, and they just die.
Okay.
Okay, so
you have a list of mitochondrial inhibitors anywhere?
yeah, I'm going to show a slide where I show all those.
All right.
This is just a little bit of how I would describe it to people. I tell you, first of all, you got a baseline metabolic rate and a baseline. Can you see my fingers?
Yes.
Okay, you got a baseline metabolic rate and a baseline oxygen and glucose delivery. This is why I call it the supply and demand theory. I used to call it neurovascular uncoupling, but people find it easier to call it supply and demand. They have to be matched to each other. Now, if you take a stimulant, you increase the metabolic rate of that neuron. When you increase the metabolic rate because of tobacco, caffeine, psychological stress, sleep deprivation, amphetamines, attention deficit medications, excitotoxins like the glycine phosphate, the beta amyloid protein, etc., you increase the metabolic rate of that neuron. Now, you're going to have to increase the oxygen and glucose delivery so it'll be able to meet these metabolic demands. But if you're doing things, let's say you have heart problem, you had a heart attack and you can't pump enough blood, congestive heart failure, okay? That's going to decrease your ability to meet these metabolic demands. Let's say you're a diabetic and you give yourself too much medicine at night, you become hypoglycemic, drop your glucose at night when you put a continuous glucose monitor on there. Diabetics used to only finger stick like about 2 or 3 times a day. But now when they can put a continuous glucose monitor, they find that a lot of them are over-treating themselves at night and they're dropping their blood glucose down. Well, you're widening that gap between metabolic rate and oxygen glucose delivery, which really means capacity of that neuron to make ATP, energy to pump that calcium out. All right, so all of the things can do it. Aortic valve disease, aortic regurgitation, overtreated hypertension. Lots of hypertensive patients are taking too much medication. If they don't treat their hypertension at all and it's severe, they'll get intracranial atherosclerosis, which will also drop oxygen and glucose delivery to these neurons. All right, if they got atrial fibrillation, very common. They're not getting enough oxygen and glucose delivery to meet this metabolic rate. Then the next thing is, so I'm making this 2-dimensional, but it's really 3-dimensional. And so in the 3rd dimension, what I'm talking about is mitochondrial function and circuit function. If you're inhibiting mitochondria or you're inhibiting the circuit pump, then you cannot meet the metabolic demands of the cell. You can't shut off the calcium. So you end up with the equivalent of an excitotoxin, something of a stimulant, really. All right, so if this gap gets too wide between the metabolic rate of the neuron and its ability to produce energy, the neuron's screwed. It works itself to death, goes into what's called excitotoxicity death. It's also called apoptosis, programmed cell death. It just says, say, screw it. We cannot continue to work at this rate. It would be like somebody working triple shift for 10 years in a row. Finally, it says, screw it. I can't do this anymore. And then apoptosis is a slow cell death where it's recycled, it's ingested by the macrophages, and they send the chemical constituents of the cell elsewhere to use them elsewhere. But the neuron is dead. And that's what I see when I look at brain MRIs. I seldom see dementia due to a stroke. And I don't see the characteristic Alzheimer's pattern of, parietal medial temporal lobe atrophy. I hardly ever see that. And by the way, why do I say Alzheimer's is a joke? Because I know if you talk to a neurologist, they'll go, Alzheimer's is the most common cause of dementia. I learned that in residency. That's right in my Ivy League textbook. And I laugh at them. I say, that's a stupid joke. And I'll tell you why I say it. You can't diagnose Alzheimer's by asking a patient a question. So you can't do it by historical findings. You can't do it by physical exam. You can't put a stethoscope on a patient and diagnose Alzheimer's. There's no blood test. You can't do a blood test and say this patient has Alzheimer's. Okay, so people say, well, you got the imaging. No, I'm a neuroradiologist, and I can tell you the imaging is not that reliable. I seldom see the so-called Alzheimer's pattern. Okay, and you can see the so-called Alzheimer's pattern in people who are not demented, and the nuclear medicine amyloid pattern in people who are not demented. They go, well, we can diagnose it at autopsy. Okay, now they found that you can't really reliably diagnose it at autopsy. The characteristic finding would be senile plaques extracellular and neurofibrillary tangles intracellular. Nope, you'll see those in patients who are not demented, and you might not necessarily see them in a patient who you thought had Alzheimer's. So you can't efficiently diagnose it at autopsy. And guess what? What about a treatment? Well, there is no treatment for Alzheimer's except a couple of drugs that don't really work and often make the patient sicker. So what I'm saying is, what would you call a disease that you can't diagnose it when the patient's alive, you can't diagnose it when the patient's dead, and you have no treatment for it? You would call that BS, and that's what it is. It's a bunch of BS, all right?
I have a question.
Now,
when you say you can't diagnose, it sounds to me like the diagnosis, if one is made, is just a judgment call on somebody, by somebody.
Exactly. What ends up happening is it's a lazy man's way to blow off the patient. Okay, this guy's he can't think straight anymore. He's got Alzheimer's. take this pill. Probably won't work, but give it a try. That's it. Stupid.
Oh, and getting back to something you said right before this, when you were describing with your hands, everything, what came to my mind was that I always try to convey this to people, that life is a balance. So what you're showing me is out of balance, right? And when you're out of balance for an extended period of time, things start to shut down. But the body seems to always want to seek that balance point. And the advice you're giving is corrective if you're out of balance, to me anyway, to bring yourself back into balance.
Right. And kind of like, how would I summarize what's the overall plan? You want to live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing.
Okay. Yeah.
Eat stuff your ancestors could have eaten hundreds of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Don't expose yourself to all this modern stuff to the extent you can avoid it.
So
it's usually
the food has grown, right? The food has grown, like the ripe fruits and the starches, for the most part anyway, with other plants as well that are low fat, are already in that balance point, right? So when you consume them, this is just my method of thinking, when you consume those balanced foods that your body recognizes as foods, the balance is maintained internally and you live as you're supposed to. But then anything you do, which is what most people do everything they do throws them off of balance. They just have a cacophony of issues, right?
Right. Processed food is full of toxic stuff, and animal foods are also toxic to us. And I say, it's right back there in the Bible, Genesis 1:29. Every fruit and plant will be food for you. Okay.
Right.
I realize there's a little more to that.
Yes.
What?
Not new information. You didn't just discover this.
Right. Yeah. The way to live is like your ancestors did hundreds of years ago under good conditions,
Mm-hmm.
They eat stuff that grows outside, mostly plants. We can't run that fast. We don't have any big claws. Our teeth are flat. We're not like a carnivore with these giant teeth and big muscles,
Yeah.
A tiger and a lion, they weigh like 450 pounds, giant claws, giant teeth, a fixed forward bite. Our jaw goes side to side to grind plants. We got flat teeth. We got a long intestinal tract. We can't make vitamin C because we eat tons of it. Oh, here's a couple interesting things, a little bit nice. This cardiologist recently published 2 case reports. This guy, Ostfeld, he's out from New York Montefiore Hospital, 2 case reports of curing patients of heart failure with a plant-based diet. And these are the first 2 case reports known.
Heart failure.
And
What's
heart failure.
What
so basically, the heart's not able to pump enough blood. Normally you'd like an ejection fraction, the left ventricle to pump out, let's say, about 55%. And in these the first patient was only pumping out 35%. The other patient is going to be pumping out only 25% with their ejection fraction. And they both came back to essentially to normal. This one went up to 50%.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Let me just comment on that too, because my layman's explanation of this from what you just said is that the body took a pump that was bad, right? Did you describe the heart as a pump? Would you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. But if there's a mechanical pump of some kind and the seals start to go bad or the piston rings are bad, there's no fixing that unless you tear the whole thing apart and redo it. But the body, you're telling me, is going to regenerate and fix itself.
Yeah. So what I'm basically saying is, let's say you have a heart muscle cell and it's dead. You can't fix that. But you could also have a heart muscle cell that's sort of, we can call it hibernating, or you can call it stunned. So it's dysfunctional, but it's not dead. And you could bring that back to life. Okay, so it's worth a try. Because, these are the first 2 case reports of this ever, just published in the last couple of years here. And I think there's a lot of other patients, like Walter Kempner back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. He had tons of patients who had terrible EKGs, and he restored them to normal. Dennis Pritikin did that. Nathan Pritikin did that on himself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot more potential to help people and to help oneself than is widely realized.
That's good. That's very optimistic. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, like same thing in the brain. I think you've got brain cells that are currently being overexcited through excitotoxicity, like we were talking about with excessive cytoplasm calcium, and eventually they're going to die. But if you catch them while they're just overworked but not dead yet, you can restore them to normal. And that's what you want to do.
Okay. And along with that, you mentioned earlier a few times in this discussion about atrophy of the brain. Is that something in general that you can modify?
Yeah, once the brain cell's dead, you can't bring it back. However, there's 2 things you could do. Number 1, exercise, study, intelligent conversation. Those will lead to what's called neurogenesis, the formation of new neurons. And that's a good thing. But there's also the concept of when a neuron dies, if a neuron dies from a stroke, a sudden massive arterial occlusion with no oxygen, it all just dies, it's dead. The dead neurons will not come back. It's called the core center of the infarct. However, on the periphery, there's what's called a penumbra. Penumbra means twilight, something that's not necessarily dead, not necessarily alive, though, either. It's not functioning normally. And if something is still hanging in there, but it's not fully dead, and all of a sudden you restore normal blood flow to it, so it can become healthy again. That's what you're really striving to do.
Okay, so that also gives a sense of urgency. Like, don't wait too long. Like,
Exactly.
don't
Yeah. In my experience, typical patient is a stupid ignoramus, and they make themselves sick, and they don't listen, and they just go down the tubes. And what I mean by that is, what people usually will say is something like, well, I'm cutting down on oil. I'm cutting down on meat. I'll have a smoothie every day. Okay, that's nice. It's a step in the right direction, but they usually don't do that well. The people who do well are the ones who take it kind of biblical. Thou shalt not eat meat. Thou shalt not eat oil. And they go, oh, that's so absolutist. You know, you're being extreme. No, think about it. It's just common sense. Number one, as you get older, you get more fragile. So you cannot mess around. What you could get away with at 20 years of age, you cannot get away with that at 50, 60, or 70.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Okay.
also want to point something out to people that may not be familiar with oil, that I would describe oil as an isolate, similar to the things that we talked about earlier, like salt and other things.
Yeah, it's not really food. It is not. Humans should not consume oil. It's this toxic industrial product. Okay, one point about arteries is there's big arteries like in the heart. Here's the left main coronary artery, the circumflex coronary artery, the left anterior descending artery. These are the big arteries on the outer surface of the heart. Those are the ones you see at a coronary angiogram, a cardiac cath. Those are the ones where they put stents in or they do surgical bypass to. But what I'm saying is the arteries that actually go into the muscle, the intramuscular branches, intramyocardial branches, they're much smaller. You can't even see them well on a cardiac cath or a CT angiogram. But you can easily plug them up from these high-fat diets and from injury related to hypertension and from amyloid clotting from having leaky gut. So that's why I'm saying is you want to do all these healthy habits because these arteries are not really fixable. The only way you can improve their blood flow, potentially with medications, but much better by fixing the diet. And you've got, thousands and thousands of miles of blood vessels all over your body. The only way you can make all of them good is by having a good diet.
Right.
There's no other way.
And it does it all at once too, right? It does. That's the thing.
Yeah.
As long as you're willing to change some habits, which I know is difficult, but you're going to get the best results possible.
Right. Yeah. It improves everything. Everything in your body improves when you do have good habits for good blood flow. Okay. Here's another case report. Same guy, Osfeld, the cardiologist from Montefiore. Another patient who was, cured of heart failure. The ejection fraction went all the way from 25% up to, I think, 50%. Where is it in here? Yeah, normal LV went to 55%. So her starting ejection fraction was 25% over here, and it went all the way up to 55. It took 5.5 months, but that saved her life. With a 25% ejection fraction, she was headed to being dead real fast, maybe within that year. And now she's normal again. That's incredible.
But less than 6 months is not that. I mean, especially if you're talking about older folks, right? Like us, 50, 60 years old. 6 months is not long.
No, and she's a 54-year-old lady.
Yeah, there you go.
It saved her life. She was screwed. Okay, she was headed towards imminent, soon death. And now she's back to normal. That's incredible. There's no pill that does that. There's no surgery that does that.
Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier, any pharmaceutical that you take, even if it has some effect on the symptoms, you're going to have negative side effects, right?
Right.
Any of those. Okay. Yeah.
Versus with a good diet, there's no side effects except more positive things. Her body weight improved, everything improved. Okay, lack of dietary fiber. There's no fiber in meat. There's very little in processed food. Then the gut lining doesn't get any butyrate. The bacteria convert the fiber into short-chain fatty acids, in particular butyrate, 4-carbon butyrate, and it's used by the gut lining cells, the enterocytes they're called, or epithelial cells of the gut, to make TJs, tight junctions, and that prevents bad things from getting across your gut lining. If you don't have tight junctions because you don't have fiber, then these bacterial toxins like LPS, lipopolysaccharide from the gram negatives, something called LTA, lipoteichoic acid from the gram positives, they'll get into the body and they'll cause all kinds of problems. Plus, big chunks of animal protein get in, they can cause leaky gut. They can cause autoimmune disease. This is a whole bunch of things right here. I listed them all that cause leaky gut. So you want to avoid these things. And what are they? The things like aspirin, NSAIDs, and in large amounts, a lot of other things, they sort of add up. The emulsifiers in processed food, alcohol, the stuff in unfiltered water, F-, etc.
Well, Dr. Rogers, also something I think that sometimes is overlooked is just drinking fiberless beverages in general, like you talked about coffee or tea, right? I mean, if you're not
Yeah.
getting calories and you're not getting any fiber, then you're going to be deficient during the day, probably, right, in your fiber intake.
That increases the likelihood you're not getting enough fiber, right? Because you're eating empty calories essentially.
Okay. Yeah, and one thing I want to mention along with that is juice, right? Juice almost always has all the fiber removed, and you're still going to end up with potential issues because of not getting enough fiber there, right?
Right. It's better to eat the fruit.
Okay.
You know, they used to say, you know, you don't improve a food by running it through a blender. Plus, I worry about people putting this stuff in a blender. They're going to be deaf. Make sure you got ear
That's
protectors.
right. Yes. Yes.
Um, so these things also make the blood more prone to clot. If you get these LPS, LTA, or have elevated excessive amounts of iron in the blood, you're more prone to it's called forming amyloid clots, meaning the secondary protein structure changes from being like a slinky, a cylinder, alpha helix it's called, to becoming beta pleated sheet, flat like a deck of cards, and they stack up and bind to each other, and they precipitate out of solution. So that means the red blood cells are sticking to each other and precipitating out of solution, fibrinogen. So they form these dense refractory clots, and they plug up little arteries. So what I was showing those small intramyocardial branches a moment ago, what I was getting at is these types of clots can potentially plug up those arteries and cause cardiac symptoms and decrease cardiac function.
And
It can
are
potentially.
those looked for? Like you as a radiologist, can you reliably see those small clots?
No, we cannot effectively see these on our imaging, but we know they exist. The guy who really pioneered our understanding of this was Douglas Kell from England and Etheresia Pretorius. She's a lady from South Africa. They both deserve a Nobel Prize, but this is not well known. But it's big stuff. It's really important thing to know about. You have to remember, conventional medicine is about selling drugs. The vast majority of doctors really don't know that much about health and disease. I know that sounds like a big statement, but it's true. Okay. If you go up to the average doctor, a fellowship trained infectious disease doctor, they won't know this. If you go up to the average rheumatology, fellowship trained rheumatologist, they probably won't know this. And I say this because I talk to doctors all the time, and I know what they know and I know what they don't know. Okay.
Yep.
And this is really important stuff. Okay, I got all this information because I read a lot. You know, I'm older now. I'm 60 years old. My kids are grown up. So I sit around reading. And I'm like, wow, this disease is already figured out. How come nobody knows about this? And I think what ends up happening is the people who write these textbooks for the big name medical centers and Ivy Leagues and medical centers, they write it for a publishing company, and Big Pharma is looking over their shoulder. They're not going to say anything that makes Big Pharma look bad or that could replace Big Pharma. And typically the way a textbook is written is the textbook company will ask some famous doctor at, let's say, an Ivy League school, can you write a textbook? He goes, oh, I'm really busy. And they don't get promoted for textbook publications. They only get promoted for research publications. So he'll take the fellow, the little trainee, like 1 year out of residency, say, hey, write this chapter. And so the chapters are often written by these really junior docs, and they don't really know what they're talking about. They just copy the old edition. And so the same nonsense that was written in 1950 gets written into the current textbooks. You'd be amazed how bad the textbooks are that doctors are trained on. They're a joke.
And the general idea is that they get almost no nutritional training. Is that correct?
They don't know anything. All of the famous nutrition doctors that you hear if you study, nutrition videos on the internet, none of them are in the books. Not a single one of them. The only one who's even mentioned in the books is Burkitt, because he helped figure out a pattern of inheritance for Burkitt's lymphoma, but there's no mention of the fact that he discovered and figured out abdominal pressure syndrome, which is about 10,000 times more important than Burkitt's lymphoma. How many cases of Burkitt's lymphoma have I seen in my life? Zero. Okay, how much abdominal pressure syndrome have I seen in my life? I see tons of cases of it every single day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most Westerners over 50 have abdominal pressure syndrome.
Wow.
Many have it in their 40s, in their 30s. It's super, super common because they eat low fiber diets.
Okay, so that fiber helps the system flow through as it should in general, right?
Right. It attracts water to the stool, making it soft. And because it's soft, it's more bulky. And then it stretches the rectum at defecation. And then defecation becomes like a reflux. The rectum is stretched, and then by reflux, it contracts and it pushes the stool out of the body. Versus what happens to a person eating a low fiber diet is you don't have that fiber to attract water to the stool. So the stool becomes like goat pellets. That does not stretch the rectal wall. So the person feels an urge to defecate, but because the rectal wall is not stretched, they don't get a reflex contraction. So they do it by straining. They tighten up their abdominal muscle. It's called the Valsalva maneuver. But as they strain, they increase their intra-abdominal pressure, and that pushes on things. It pushes their stomach up into the chest, causing hiatal hernia through the hiatus of the diaphragm, stomach is moved into the chest. And then they get GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, where the acid from the stomach goes up into the chest, causes a heartburn-like symptom, retrosternal pain. They get back pressure into the sigmoid colon, so they get diverticulosis, diverticulitis. The dry stool in the appendix forms a rock, obstructs the appendix. The mucus glands below continue to secrete. Appendix pops. That's appendicitis. They get more hernias, inguinal hernias, periumbilical hernias. So it's a big mess.
What about what I see when I look online is that 95% of people don't get enough fiber every day. Do you think that's accurate?
Oh yeah, the average American only eats 5 to 10 grams per day. At a minimum, they should be eating 40 or 50 per day. And Burkett says we're designed to eat 100 or more per day. Okay. I looked at my diet. My diet was like 110 a day. It was pretty average for me.
All right, that's good. Yeah, I just kind of tell people 50 as a minimum. That's kind of what I tend to say.
Yeah, I think that's a good amount.
Okay.
So here's the mitochondria. Here's the outer mitochondrial membrane. The green is the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's where all the key proton pumps and enzymes are. And inside is the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, the mitochondria is just an incredible thing. You take a hydrogen molecule, and you separate the electron from the proton, meaning the positive charge. So the negative charges electrons are passed down through a series of carriers like a fireman bucket brigade. Okay, and then the proton component is pumped into the intramembranous space between the inner mitochondrial membrane, IMM. This is the intramembranous space, IMS, and then there would be an outer mitochondrial membrane above this. And one of the things I would share with you is look how incredible this is. What is happening here is the cell has split the atom. Okay, you have an atom of hydrogen, and you split it. You take the two components to the atom are the electrons, that is split, and that is passed down this gradient of carriers, and you separate the proton from it, and you pump the proton into the intramembranous space. So this is another thing what I meant by when you study human physiology, molecular biology, biochemistry, it's so complicated. It's so amazing that it makes me believe in God because it's too incredible, okay? They figured out how to split the atom millions, billions of years ago, whenever it was. That's incredible. And that's how they use to make almost all the energy in the human body.
Right.
That's pretty smart. And they just harvest the gradient of protons by letting a proton come back through, and that spins the ATP synthase, and then it can add a phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphates, to make adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphates. And that's how energy is produced in the human body.
That's if everything's working right.
When everything works correctly, yeah. And here's just the same thing. This is the system of carriers, that hand off the electrons to each other. Oxygen sitting around in the matrix will then receive the electrons at the final pumping station. And this is like air under pressure, and then the pressure gradient is used. So when let a proton come through, it'll spin the ATP synthase, and then this phosphate's added to it. The gradient's incredible. The gradient across the inner mitochondrial membrane is negative 160 millivolts. That's like it's like a coal burning electric plant. That's like having lightning going across this little tiny membrane. It's the highest gradient I'm aware of. It's amazing. Okay, now here's what happened. All these things here are mitochondria inhibitors. If you go to the biochemistry books, I got like about 7 biochemistry books. I was going to be a biochemist when I was younger. I wanted to do that. I decided later to become a clinical doctor. There's nothing about mitochondrial inhibition in any of them. But I knew I had read about mitochondrial inhibitors in different papers before and heard about it with antibiotics. So there's got to be more of them. So I started going through the journal articles, like the PubMed and whatnot, and I'm like, holy shit. I quickly found over 50 of them. So doctors don't know any of them. They're not taught any of this, not a word of it. But this is some of the most important things you can know about life on Earth. Mitochondria is where our energy comes from, and there's a lot of common things inhibiting our mitochondria. So first of all, high dietary fat, especially saturated fat, will inhibit the inner mitochondrial membrane about right here, about complex 3, and then it'll back up, and that's a big thing in diabetes. All right, but look at all these common things. Glyphosate inhibits here, complex 2. Cadmium, a common contaminant. Atrazine on the corn. F- in your tap water. Omega-6 oils are converted into these toxic aldehydes like HNE. That inhibits ATP synthase. Lead contamination, we just talked about it being common in a lot of things, is inhibiting the mitochondrial membrane. Very common medicines. Statins, one of the most commonly prescribed medicines, inhibits at the level of coenzyme Q. Not good. Maybe that's why it's associated with increased risk of diabetes. Metformin, so-called diabetes therapy, is inhibiting the beginning of the electron transport chain. It's another reason why I would never take something like that. Common medicine, Tylenol is an inhibitor of it as well. Okay, common sedative, propofol. They put mold inhibitors, which are also antifungals, into all the processed foods so it doesn't grow mold, get returned to the company. Mitochondrial inhibitor. Okay. TCE for dry cleaning. So I don't go to dry cleaners anymore. Mitochondrial inhibitor. The antidepressants, the SSRIs, serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, mitochondrial inhibitors. Haldol, anti-schizophrenic medication, mitochondrial inhibitor. It goes on and on. There's a whole bunch more, and they're common. Fluoroquinolone antibiotics, beta-lactam, penicillin antibiotics, aminoglycoside antibiotics.
So a lot of these things are supposedly the solutions or the maintenance for for a condition. But what you're describing here is that when you're taking these things, they're also making your overall balance worse, it seems like.
Right. To me, like people hear the word pill and they think, oh, that's a medicine that'll help me. When I hear the word pill, to me, that means poison. Okay. It poisons an enzyme system typically in your body.
Okay.
All right. And then you make a trade-off. Is there a benefit to poisoning that enzyme system? And what is the benefit? But what I'm trying to say is you don't poison your way to health.
Right.
Tons of people are on 10, 15, 20 meds. Stupid.
So,
okay.
So there would be no benefit then. Is that right for any of those?
Well, what I'm saying is there's always a trade-off. And I think that quite often the side effects are understated and the benefits are exaggerated.
And okay, for the side effects, would it be accurate to say that the only side effects that are conveyed to the patient, if the patient bothers to read the information, are the ones that they're legally required to tell you?
Yeah, they usually don't. They usually maybe mention the most common ones. They wouldn't have enough time to mention all the potential ones. And what I'm saying is, look, all you got to do is live like Adam and Eve, and you have the best possible chance, and just hope for the best. That's like a smart thing to do. That's what I do. I'm 60 years old. I don't take any pills.
Yeah.
Versus what the typical chump does is, they're fat, sick, and stupid. Their blood pressure's high. They get on some blood pressure pills. Their blood sugar's high. They get on some diabetes pills. They got atherosclerosis risk factors and related problems. So they take something for atherosclerosis, blood thinners, anticoagulants. Then they're impotent. They got a pill for that. They got gastroesophageal reflux. They got a pill for that. And they just keep accumulating all these pills.
Well, Dr. Rogers, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you don't want to do that. But like, what if someone's watching this video and they say, oh, Dr. Rogers, yeah, he is a smart doctor. You went to Stanford, right? I mean,
yeah, for college, I went to Stanford.
Yeah, the average person doesn't do that. They might say, well, you won the genetic lottery over there, Dr. Rogers. This doesn't apply to me. What do they say?
Yeah, and what I would say is everybody's got physiology. There's a few people who got rare genetic disease. Everybody else is pretty similar, okay? And what I'm telling you is just common sense. And then the other thing that helps confirm it is, like I just referred to earlier, the epidemiology. 1 billion out of 1 billion rice eaters are skinny. Potato eaters are skinny. Okay, sweet potato eaters are skinny. Look at Papua New Guinea when back when they used to eat 93% of their calories from sweet potatoes. They were skinny, muscular, and fit. And they didn't have much lung cancer, even though they smoked like chimneys. They had over 6 times less lung cancer than the Westerners because the Westerners not only smoked a lot, they were eating a high-fat diet.
Yeah. So way off balance, right? So the more you're in balance, the more your body can recover from, it sounds like.
Right. So my attitude is I just try to do everything right. To me, it's like being in a video game. Okay. So when you walk through your daily life, you're like one of the Super Mario brothers in a video game. You do the good stuff, you get energy points. They give you more energy capacity. You do the bad stuff, you screw up, you eat some fried food or something, it lowers your health capacity. So the smart move is do all the good stuff and avoid all the bad stuff. And try to be as healthy as you can be. What I see a lot of people do is they're sort of like, well, at least I'm not as fat as my cousin. Okay, well, is your goal in life to just not be as fat as your cousin? My goal is to be what's the best I could do. I'll try to do that. And I think that's what you should aspire to, because when you aspire towards what's the best I could do, when you keep learning and you find a new problem, you try to fix it, then you'll keep on improving and you'll be the best you could be.
Yeah.
Versus,
this is important. I mean, the whole point you're bringing up here, I feel like is far-reaching, because if you are trying to do the best that you can have fun in life, right? I mean, hopefully the day you die, just about. But then when you start doing poorly, it's like doing bad at school. Then you're less motivated to do things. You don't want to continue life, et cetera, right? So that alone is a reason why you want to try to do the best you can. I know a lot of people are so far off balance, like you're describing here, your average patient, that they can't even see this. They just feel so bad, I would think. Is that true?
yeah, like a typical thing that gets said to me, let's say at a social event, they'll go, well, don't you want some pizza or a beer or something like that? And I'm like, thanks, no thanks. And they're like, oh, you're missing out on life. Why don't you just relax and have a good time? And sort of what goes through my mind is, for me, plugging up my arteries, I don't think that would be fun. And I realize it's not a big deal if a person eats healthy all year round and then they just have a little bit of a beer and a pizza at a big holiday. That's not that big of a deal. But I also believe to some extent, it's a little bit like alcoholics and cigarette smokers. You don't tell an alcoholic you could drink on a weekend. You don't drink anymore. You don't tell a smoker you could smoke on a weekend. You don't smoke anymore because that's what works. And the other thing is, I want to make it clear, it's not like some people are sick. Most people are sick. The average American is fat, sick, and stupid by the time they're 60, if not sooner. I don't want to end up like that.
Yeah.
I'm real happy everything works. I'm real happy I'm aging better than all the doctors and nurses and technologists my age.
Yeah,
I'm glad.
That's excellent. You're an excellent example. Let me ask you another question. I hear that the United States has the highest per capita medical expenditure in the world, but some of the worst results. Is that accurate?
Oh, yeah, that's true. Americans are fat and sick and stupid, okay? And so all this money they spend on the healthcare system is a big joke, and it's never going to change. That's the other thing, too. I said it before, and people don't like to hear it, but I'll tell you the truth. The only thing that could fix medicine would be Christianity, in my opinion, a biblical worldview whereby you say to yourself, man is created in the image of God, therefore part divine, therefore he is of intrinsic high value. We value his well-being above all else, and therefore we shall make his well-being our priority. Because the default system of education in the United States is what you call atheistic Darwinism. It became popular in England in the 1800s. And, my father is of Irish descent. And so I'm very familiar with the history of England and Ireland. And they love atheistic Darwinism because what it basically says is survival of the fittest. Might is right. And so whoever has the superior power should be allowed to do whatever they want. Might is right. So they made the Irish basically into slaves for about 1,000 years. And what I'm trying to say is the same thing has happened in medicine, but most people just don't understand it. Let's say a person has coronary artery disease. If they put a stent into the coronary arteries, that's about $30,000. All right. If they do open heart surgery, a CABG, coronary artery bypass graft, they get paid, including the rehab, about $150,000. If they teach the patient a vegan diet, they get, if they're lucky, $1,000. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, unless you love that patient, there's no way in a million years you're ever going to teach them the vegan diet when you can make $150,000 off them with an open heart surgery.
Right.
And so what I'm saying is, let's say you have two parents, mother and father, okay, and they're both really kind of stupid, no education, kind of lazy. Despite all of that, they're still the two best people in the world for that baby. Why? Because they love that baby. They love that kid. They'll do anything for that kid. They'll go through a brick wall for that kid.
Right.
And what I'm trying to say is medicine's the opposite. The people who run medicine, they hate the stupid patient. They're a bunch of low-life peasants, okay? They'll drug a child with amphetamines if they can make an extra $5 that day, okay? So what I'm really saying is all the medical, surgical, bullshitology, technology, it makes no difference if you don't love the patient, okay? And the system doesn't love the patient. And you can't fix that. The only thing that could fix that would be a worldview that says, we love this individual. We will do what is right for them no matter what. You have to have that no matter what. We don't care about the money. And what I'm trying to say is medicine can never go there because it would lose money. It won't accept that. It will never accept that.
Well,
and that's why it will never be fixed.
Okay.
And anybody who thinks otherwise doesn't really know what they're talking about. Believe me, I live in it. I lived in it for many years. I grew up in it.
You have. That's right. I see. Maybe I'm overly optimistic. I think that I tend to think anyway that if enough information, correct information gets out to folks in a grassroots type movement, eventually they'll make certain things illegal. Because like if you look at
No. It's very naive. You're thinking naive, okay? The patient is of zero importance. Zero. They don't matter. It doesn't matter if the patient dies tomorrow. If the doctor practices a standard of care, it does not matter what happens to the patient. And the standard of care is written at the Ivy League and the other big name centers based on what the drug company wants. They write the standard of care. So it's always going to be give more drugs. That's never going to change. Okay, and the insurance companies are in on it too. McDougall would talk about how he tried to get reimbursement for teaching patients about a vegan diet to help minimize coronary artery disease, and they refused to do it. And the insurance company executive told him off the record, look, the more it costs the more money we get, the higher the premiums get. We get a piece of the pie too. The insurance companies want the patient billed as much as possible. The drug companies want the patients billed as much as possible. The device makers for surgical implantation devices want the patient billed as much as possible. The hospital corporations want the patient billed as much as possible. Doctors are the middleman caught in the middle, and they want to help the patient, but they have to pay their allegiance to the people who pay their bills and control their jobs. In every hospital in the Western world, there's a bean counter. And the bean counter always says to the doctors, look, there's doctors at some other hospital who are doing more work than you. They're generating more billing codes per day. You guys are kind of lazy. You better get your numbers up or we're going to let you go. And so every day they got to bust their tail to get as many billing codes generated as possible. That's why they tend to always be in a hurry, kind of brusque, because they got to get their billing codes for the day. And if they don't please the bean counter, they could get fired. Okay, so let's say they start talking to patients about the vegan diet. They're going to be staying late every day. They're going to be physically exhausted. They're already working long hours, and the bean counter is going to tell them, "Look, you're not pulling your weight. All the other doctors in the clinic are seeing 30 patients a day. You're only seeing 20 a day. You're being lazy. We're not going to put up with it. You start seeing 30 a day, or you're out of here." Okay, so they're going to have to start seeing 30 a day. So basically, they have to prioritize. Either they play ball the way the system wants them to and sell a lot of drugs, and so they can pay off their loans, they can keep their wife happy, keep their job, keep their home, or they go the poor man's route and just teach the patients vegan diet, and they'll be lucky to make hardly any money. It's hard to make money doing this, and so that's why I don't think it's ever going to change. I have zero expectation of improvement. I actually think it's going to keep getting worse.
So you feel like the system keeps engineering that out of what's rewarded?
Right. It's designed to sell drugs.
Okay.
All of the people who run the system, they want as many drugs sold as possible. One of the reasons why they're replacing doctors with nurse practitioners is that way they can sell the drugs more effectively.
Mhm.
If you have to pay a doctor $200,000 a year, that's cutting into the cost margin. So what you do is you get a nurse practitioner, pay her $90,000 a year, and she prescribes the same drugs. Now, because it's bankrupting all these countries. But if you can get the provider to have a lower salary, in the future, they'll probably have an RN prescribing or a PharmD, okay? That way they can still sell the drugs and get the drug money, but the provider gets less. And the other thing is they talk about artificial intelligence. It's a crock of BS. Artificial intelligence is going to be written by the drug company, and the Ivy League guy who's kissing the butt of the drug company, it's going to sell as many drugs as possible. But then what they're going to say is because it's computer-generated knowledge and therefore it's infallible in our modern religion of science, they're going to have an RN doing it or something, and she's going to get paid, $50,000 a year, and they'll sell even more drugs. I see this as inevitable. The only thing that can change is that the few individuals that are smart enough with an amount of intellectual curiosity to watch these videos, read these books, they can learn how to keep themselves healthy. But I think the average chump is just going to be drugged even more in the future.
Well, we appreciate your advice or your just conveyance of this truth, because we do have an audience that is interested in that, and we're very thankful for that. But I want to ask one other question that's related to this. This sounds like it may be an exception to me. I don't know if you can comment on this or not. But I from what I see from marketing anyway, I see like it seems like Kaiser Permanente wants people to take care of themselves. I don't know. Is there
maybe I don't think anybody's going to be allowed to, because usually in the system there's not a lot of free choice. Okay. You basically play ball with what the controllers want, or you're out. I don't see that likely to change. I've heard that Kaiser Permanente maybe wants to make things better. I don't know how true it is. I don't have much experience with them. Theoretically, the idea makes sense, but in actual practice, I usually don't see anybody with any resources trying to make things better, okay? If some individual tries to make things better, they're going to get smacked down by the system, so it's not going to be tolerated. They can do something on their own. That will be allowed on a small scale, but on a big scale, I don't think so. Okay. Imagine you were making $1 billion a year. Would you want the business to change and cut your profits down to go from 1 billion to make 1 million? No way. You would fight that tooth and nail. And if you got $1 billion to prevent a change, you're going to spend a lot of money to prevent it, and it's not going to be allowed.
Well,
that's why. Like, here's the question: why should anybody care about you? Why should anybody love you? Why should anybody give a rat's tail about you? The reality is, unless they have what I would call a Christian or a Bible-based worldview, where they said man is created in the image of God. All human life is sacred. Therefore, we'll do the best we can for this person. Unless they have that, somebody's going to tell them, look, you want to make $1,000 or $150,000? Look, I'll take the $150,000. Unless they love you, they're going to go for the $150,000.
Well,
that's why you can't get rid of morals and values, because that's what determines what people do.
okay, I get you. It makes sense. All that makes sense to me. I guess I'm still waiting on a paradigm shift. That's what I'm waiting on. Like, and I've seen it in other industries, and I'm hoping it'll happen in this, but like you said, maybe I'm just overly optimistic, but I still
Fantasy land. And the other thing too is I think doctors are getting stupider. And I can tell you something. You would say, should conventional medicine love me? I'm first in my class, so smart and all this stuff. No, conventional medicine does not like people like me, does not like people like McDougall. Why would it? We're telling people that there's a better way than just being hooked on 20 different pills. Okay. I do it because of my own ego and my own personality, but I don't do it for money. I don't even monetize my YouTube channel. What I'm trying to say is the money wants the drugs to be sold. And the money is going to make sure the drugs are going to be sold. And the employees are not going to be allowed to be employees unless they're selling drugs. It's a drug dealing business. It's the biggest drug gang there is. And, the drug gang is going to protect its turf. And that's just a fact. And there's nothing going to change that. And like I said,
I also want to, again, thank you for your service to humanity. Because like you said, you're doing this for specific reasons that are not rewarded. So
right. Yeah, I sort of feel it's my destiny to try to be the best doctor in the world. So I do this to give people a chance. But, I know most people won't listen, but there's a few who will. And so we'll help them.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. I very much appreciate that. I know we kind of went off on a tangent there, and you have a few more things to say. So
yeah, I'm just about done with the slides. But here's basically looking at the diet. Typical Western diet. It's a high-fat diet. Tons of coronary artery atherosclerosis. Most common cause of death is a heart attack. Lack of blood flow causes ischemia. Lack of oxygen delivered to tissue. Well, it also causes a lot of cancer. We've got tons of cancer and tons of impotence. Okay, more than half of men are impotent by 50 years of age in a Western country. Here's the old East Asian, and basically their diet was pretty healthy with all the rice. And they ate a lot of vegetables too. What got them in trouble is they smoked like chimneys with the tobacco, and they had sodium off the charts, like more than 12 grams a day. All right. So that's what would get them into trouble, cause strokes and stuff. But they were still relatively healthy because their diet was so low in fat, and they ate the vegetables. South Asian, like in India, the main thing getting them sick is they ate too much fried food. They have some saturated fat from the ghee and the yogurt and stuff. Ghee is kind of like butter, but they have and they have a lot of sodium. But the big thing is they have way too much oil. That's what screws them up. That's why they have a lot of diabetes and coronary heart disease in the Indian diet. It tastes good, all the fried food, but it makes people sick.
Yeah, well,
and here's
we love that. We have our healthy vegan food standard, which is behind me, which kind of mostly matches up with what you say, but it's a lower level standard. But we do events based on that, and we do one every year at an Indian restaurant, and we love it when they do it without oil. They can't fry anything, like you're saying. They don't add any salt, but they don't like doing it.
Yeah, and this is the most powerful thing in all of health is this low fat, low sodium vegan diet. And that's why I laugh, is that a health coach who knows this can cure more people and help himself more than the chief of Harvard or Yale or any of the Ivy League schools.
Right.
So in a sense too, that's one of my internal medicine friends told me. He said, Pete, I've read your books, I've watched your videos, and he says, you're right. You're a genius, and I bow to your knowledge. He said, it's amazing what you've done, how you put all this stuff together. He says, but let me tell you something. So I said to him, I go, okay, thanks. You admit that? Well, how come you never invite me to talk? And he goes, Pete, I'm never going to invite you to talk, nor is any other doctor ever going to invite you to speak in a conventional setting. He goes, they can't do it. They won't do it. Nobody makes any money with this vegan stuff. And on top of it, it's like an insult. These guys worked all their life to become an attending or chief of a department. Do you think they want you coming along saying all their textbooks are wrong, that all the drugs they prescribe don't work and there's a better way? No way. That's an insult. They're never going to support you. And as a matter of fact, if they think that you're coming on their turf, they're going to send people out to discredit you. Yeah. It's just never going to happen. You're always going to be shadow banned. You're never going to be allowed to become well known. It's just a fact. They're always going to promote all the paleo, keto, carnivore nonsense. There's no science behind it. That's always going to be promoted on the internet because they have to keep all these people fat and sick to make money off them. And we're just going to keep prescribing the drugs, and nothing's going to change. It's just the way it is. It's nice of you to do the work that you've done, but nothing's going to change. So I appreciate knowing it. I want to know it for myself, for my family, and for a few friends that are willing to learn from it. But it's never going to become widespread. Just a fact. And I think he's right.
I think that, like I said, I mentioned, I still feel overly optimistic, I guess, about a paradigm shift. And I do get what you're saying, though. I would fully agree that anybody who's the status quo never likes to see a change, right? And yeah, we're talking about big money, like you said, so it's even worse.
They
But
make $1 billion. You think they're going to let their $1 billion business be outcompeted by some vegan BS? They're going to go, no way, get the heck out of here. They will do anything they can to discredit it and ruin it if they think it's real competition. Right now, they consider it a joke, which it pretty much is a joke. Okay.
like you said, it's only a few people that are willing to have an open mind enough to actually hear it, learn it, and then put it into practice. Very small. I would agree with that.
Right. How many people you know are 100% vegans? Not many.
Yeah, right.
I got tons and tons of people I know, and they've seen me over the years, and they're like, well, gee, you're aging so well, you're still so energetic, strong, and smart. I wish I was like that. I go, well, you got to become low-fat vegan. They go, well, I'm not ready to do that.
Yeah.
That's what they all say.
And like you said, I don't know many that are 100% vegan, and then low fat. That's a whole other category of.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Here's a typical story. I have a doctor friend, right? And his wife having some problems, right? So I tell him what to do, and he's like, oh, she's cutting down on oil and this and that. But they don't go 100%. They always half-ass, not always, but most of the time they half-ass everything. And you don't get all the benefits. Like an alcoholic. The alcoholic says, well, I only drink on weekends. Well, they're not going to do that much better if they're only drinking on weekends. And if they tell you they're only drinking on weekends, they're probably drinking more than just on weekends. Yeah. And they don't do that well. Yeah, the guy who does well is the one who quits drinking. No more alcohol. That's it.
Yeah, the compliance is a huge part of this, because everything you say, I acknowledge and I believe. But then there's the issue of compliance, which is major, because so many people don't do what they say they're going to do. And then because of that, a lot of people think that these techniques that you're discussing don't work. And that's a whole other issue.
Oh, yeah. What a lot of people tell me is, how could we ever know what is true? Because all the so-called experts, they all contradict each other. And what I would say is, number one, you can look at the epidemiology. 1 billion out of 1 billion rice eaters are skinny without diabetes or hypertension or autoimmune disease. It doesn't get much better than that. How's that? Is that a big enough sample set for you? 1 billion people?
Yeah.
Okay. And, it's just all, like McDougall said, all the healthy large populations, they're all starch-based populations. There is no fruitarian population. And there is no animal food, meat-eating, oil-eating population that's sort of what we would consider healthy.
Right. Right. And also what I'm commenting on as well is just like, let's say the standard American person, because I'm in the United States most of the time, that person's not compliant. Even when they say they're going to do something, there's so much negative peer pressure surrounding them everywhere that they just can't stick to it.
Yeah, and what a lot of people do is, I think, just like we have a herbivore physiology for eating food, I think we tend to have herbivore mentality, whereby a herbivore, let's say you got a herd of them, they all sitting around grazing in the grass in the middle of the field. The safe place to be is in the middle of the herd. What I mean by that is a natural human average brain finds it safest to be in the middle of the pack. Mm-hmm. So they say things like everything in moderation. Right. And I got doctor relatives who tell me, you're just a crazy autistic person. You would eat the grass if you thought it would make you healthy. Nobody's going to become 100% vegan. I'm like, do whatever you want. But I'm aging way better than all of them. No comparison even. What I'm trying to say is even doctors think that way.
Right.
Okay. Doctors also tend to be quite conformist. They're rewarded for conformity. They're not rewarded for being innovative and contrarian.
They're punished the way you describe it.
They're punished for being innovative and contrarian in a big way. Anyways, here's Jack Delatorre's book, Alzheimer's Turning Point. This guy did great research on dementia. He would tie off the internal carotid artery in a mouse, and 2 months later, the mouse will become demented. He was expecting a big stroke on the same side that he tied off the carotid. He then did autopsies on the mice, and there was no stroke. The brain was just shrunken. Atrophy is the word for shrunken. And so you just see all these atrophic brains. He tied off both carotids, tried off the middle cerebral artery, etc. By the way, this is Asian atherosclerosis intracranial, like those Japanese would get from smoking cigarettes and eating all the sodium. This is Western atherosclerosis in the heart from eating high-fat diets in particular. So coronary artery disease impotence is characteristic Western atherosclerosis. Intracranial is characteristic Asian atherosclerosis. Some people, of course, have both.
And you said that Asian is due to high sodium levels? Is that what you said?
Yeah, from the hypertension. Isolated hypertension will cause intracranial atherosclerosis versus high-fat diets will also cause a lot of coronary artery especially, but also cause some carotid. Coronary is a lot more common than carotid.
One thing I wanted to mention too is that I've always seen it. It's been like ubiquitous in all the grocery stores is ramen noodles, and this extreme high sodium in that, and people use that as a staple. I know, because it's so inexpensive, but I guess, all these issues, like you're saying, in the brain. So it's not good.
Yeah, I'm going to bet you it's got. I don't know what ingredients are in it, but I would just bet you, being that it's a processed food, it's going to have a lot of fungal inhibitors in there, mold inhibitors that are going to be mitochondrial inhibitors, and I would bet you also it probably has a lot of MFG, MSG in there, glutamate off the charts. Typically, that's in soups.
And just the
So
sodium levels in general, I think you look at, I've seen these packs, they're more than 1,500 milligrams, most of them, for just one serving that you'd have, you know. So
yeah, I would never eat that stuff, but I realize that's very common. People eat that stuff all the time.
yes, yes, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so, and that the other thing too is people will say to me, "Oh, like, you know, I got family members and relatives. They'll say, you're too extreme, you're too extreme," and I'm like, you know, again, what they're doing is they're defaulting to the normal position, like the herd mentality.
Right.
Whereas I have what I would call, my mentality is, what is the best? I want to do whatever the best thing is to do.
Yeah, and like
I
you
don't
said,
care. I don't care what the average fat, sick, and stupid person does. To me, they're like mental retards. I care about what's the best I could do. I'm not at all affected by peer pressure in terms of like behavior. Because, I mean, don't get me wrong, for social behavior, you want to get along with people. But what I'm trying to say is, I see tons of patients. They're all fat, sick, and stupid. I want to do the opposite of what normal people do, because they're screwed.
that's right. So that's what I tell people. Normal is sick. That's what I see.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, if you told me that a patient was 60 years old, my age, in a hospital, I would not even look at the chart. I would automatically assume the patient was pre-diabetic or diabetic. Automatically. I would automatically assume that they have fatty liver. I would automatically assume they're hypertensive and they have coronary artery disease and they're impotent. I would just expect that. Okay. And they're high risk for cancer and for stroke and these other problems. That would be assumed.
Right. And you'd probably be correct.
A safe assumption. And that's based on having experience with many thousands of patients.
Yeah, now, that's something I want to point out to people watching, is that you are actually practicing medicine. You're
Yeah, I'm
not,
a triple boarded doctor.
yes, yes.
I'm a triple boarded Harvard trained doctor.
Okay. Yeah, because that's
I got a lot of clinical experience.
yeah, I hear a lot of people that make a lot of comments that online. You see that they feel like they know what they're talking about, but so many of those folks are not practicing medicine, where you're actually having interactions with the patients on a daily basis. Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, when I talk about dementia, I don't know how many thousands, over 10,000 brains I've seen, demented brains. Here is what an artery looks like when it's wide open. These are circle of Willis arteries in the brain. And here's an artery with atherosclerotic plaque accumulating in it. In these pictures, it kind of looks like a cheese pizza. But when you look at them in reality, they usually look like blood clots. Okay, so anyways, you start plugging up these arteries, you get less blood supply to the brain. All right, now here's what happens with hypertension. First of all, here's a normal artery. Here's the red blood cells traveling through the artery. And these are the red blood cells. This is the capillary. These are the capillary endothelial cells. The yellow is the basement membrane. Okay, that's sort of the barrier between the artery and things outside of it. These are smooth muscle cells that line the artery and can contract to narrow its diameter. The blue circles are the oxygen passing from the red blood cell, it's hemoglobin, out to the cell. So here's a brain cell, a neuron, and it needs lots of oxygen because it's a very high energy cell. And this is good oxygen delivery. Now, here's what happens in a typical Westerner. Because they've had all the high-fat diets, high-sodium diets, all this junk all these years, their capillary basement membrane gets thickened, especially by diabetes. Their vascular smooth muscle cells also become hypertrophied. There's also connective tissue in here that gets thickened as well. So you're increasing the distance from the capillary to the tissue. That's going to lower oxygen delivery. Thicker capillary basement membrane, thicker vascular muscles, smooth muscle cells. All of this is going to diminish the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue. The more you diminish this oxygen, the less this cell can make energy, can make ATP in its mitochondria. So you're damaging the cells. All right, now here's a good looking normal brain. Small ventricles, cerebral spinal fluid is located in the ventricles. Here's the brain tissue, the brain parenchyma surrounding it. This would be a young brain. This would be like a typical 30-year-old, 40-year-old looking brain. We call it a tight brain too, because the brain parenchyma, it's uptight against the skull. This is an MRI. It's actually called a flare sequence, which is like a CSF suppressed T2. But what it really means is this is normal. Small ventricles, normal parenchyma. Now, this would be like a typical American 85-year-old, but I see sometimes people in their 40s that look like this. But this would be a typical American 80 years old and up. There's all this white stuff, these bright spots. These are bad. These are small strokes. Quite often, these are silent strokes, meaning that they don't cause a physical defect like hemiplegia, inability to move an arm or a leg, but they cause cognitive slowing. And the person thinks slower, they walk slower, they move slower. They're just having a diminishment of their capacity. They'll often walk with these short shuffling steps, or with a cane or a walker. Okay, what I'm trying to tell you is this happens all the time. I see this all the time. But I'll also tell you, I very often see a brain that's clean around the ventricles, but is now kind of a loose or a sagging brain. The sulci, the spaces in between the brain gyri, are filling up with more and more cerebral spinal fluid. Notice how the ventricles are bigger, more cerebral spinal fluid. So the brain is a fixed space. Whenever the brain parenchyma shrinks, it's lost, it's replaced by fluid. So big ventricles, big sulci is all characteristic of an atrophic brain. The point I wanted to make was the most common thing I see is the brain is shrunken down, the cerebral spinal fluid spaces are expanded, but I often don't see hardly any of these, sometimes none of these little silent strokes in my demented patients. And the reason is they're undergoing apoptosis, like Delatorre was talking about. Here's what's really happening. Internal carotid artery comes up into the brain. There's an anterocerebral, I'm not drawing on here because it'd be too complicated, but here's the middle cerebral artery. Here's the lenticular striatus going into the basal ganglia region. The MCA, middle cerebral artery, continues on along the cerebral convexities, and then it has little penetrating arteries that go into the brain tissue. This right here where the skull and crossbones is drawn is in the deep white matter, periventricular white matter, meaning the white matter tissue. White matter is the myelinated fibers. The cell bodies are in the gray matter cortical ribbon on the periphery. Cortex means bark, like the bark of a tree. Just like you have a tree stump, you see the dark stuff along the outer part, like the bark. Okay, so anyways, the point I'm making is these little penetrating arteries don't have a lot of collateral. So if you drop the blood pressure, or if you occlude them with atherosclerosis, there might not be any other good way to get blood to these areas. That's why you get all those little bright spots I showed you on that a moment ago on that MRI, deep white matter silent strokes. So what I'm saying is, with hypertension, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you don't ever treat the hypertension, it damages the arteries by high pressure, and that drops blood flow to the deep white matter. If you overtreat the hypertension and drop the pressure too low, that will also drop the blood flow. So either way, you're screwed. You're going to end up with silent strokes. And the best thing to do is eat a healthy diet so you don't ever get high blood pressure. You don't need to take a pill for normal pressure. All right. So that's the smart thing to do, because I see tons of those. Every day I'll see hundreds and hundreds of these little silent strokes.
Okay,
and
so
we call them silent.
Dr. Rogers, you're saying let nature balance that out rather than pharmaceuticals.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Because what I'm trying to say is God made the food that you're supposed to eat. It's the plants that grow outside. That's what we're designed to run on. Mm-hmm. You eat that stuff. In these places where they eat that way, they don't ever get hypertensive. The 70-year-old's got the same blood pressure as a teenager, okay? Yep. And they don't ever get diabetes, and they're skinny, all right? When you start messing around with all the modern high-fat foods and processed foods with all the toxic chemicals and everything, you end up hypertensive and diabetic, and you start plugging up arteries all over the place, getting all these silent strokes, and then you try treating the blood pressure and the diabetes with pills, and they can maybe slow it down a little bit, not much, and you end up screwed, fat, sick, and stupid by 60. And, frankly, demented not that long afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So
what I'm trying to say is, thank God there's a way to win the game. You're not automatically screwed. It's not inevitable that you have to be fat, sick, and stupid.
That's good news.
Yeah. And the proper attitude is, thank God. All I have to do is eat a vegan diet. I'll do it. I mean, it's a great deal. You're not going to get a better deal than that in life. Okay. So, but, every typical stupid person, I'd rather die than stop eating meat. You're going to take away my ice cream? That's one of the few joys I have in life. That's like a typical stupid person. Okay, so here's Delatorre's experiment, tied off the internal carotid artery. Mouse is demented about 2 months later. And what I'm saying is there's a lot of things that'll do that. Because at first glance, a person will say, well, so what? Not that many people have severe internal carotid artery stenosis. Yeah, you're right. Not that many do. But guess what? Tons of people got congestive heart failure, decreased pumping to the brain, mouse equivalent. Atrial fibrillation, loss of atrial filling in the heart. Mouse equivalent. Obstructive sleep apnea. They're not breathing enough at night. The brain's hypoxic at night. Mouse equivalent. Diabetes, overtreated, too much insulin or other medications. Hypoglycemic at night. Mouse equivalent. Aortic regurgitation, valvular disease. Aortic stenosis, valvular disease. Mouse equivalent. Coronary artery bypass graft. Post-op hypotension. Anesthesiologist runs their pressure real low because he doesn't want them bleeding out at the anastomoses. Mouse equivalent. My father had an open heart surgery at Cabbage. I stayed with him in the ICU post-op. This was many, many, many years ago, before I knew enough to talk him out of it. I tried to talk him out of it anyways. And back then I knew about Ornish, but I didn't know about Esselstyn yet. I didn't know about Armstrong. I didn't know all the other research because I would have come down more strongly on it. But anyways, they ran him hypotensive, like 90 over 60. I was like, holy crap. Luckily, he didn't stroke. He came out of it fine. He was a lot healthier than the average Cabbage patient. He was a doctor at the time, about 74 years of age. But what happened was, they stapled the lemma to the LID, a left internal mammary artery to the left anterior descending artery. And then he shovels snow. He's kind of feisty when he shovels snow. He had a stroke. He dissected his vertebral artery, had a stroke about 4 years later, and that ruined his life. He had to retire and couldn't do hardly anything after that. And he probably never would have dissected his vertebra. He'd been shoveling snow for 50 years before that with no problem.
Right.
This is just a slide to show all the things that increase calcium. Tons of things do, and you want to avoid all these things. And these slides are kind of not even really necessary, but just the obesity epidemics come up at the same time. Heart disease came up a little bit before that. But the big thing is these oils, and the oils correlate better with the diabetes and the obesity than the sugar does. Sugar doesn't correlate that tight. Sugar is not the problem. They like to blame everything on sugar. I had more slides. We don't really got time to go into all this.
Yeah.
Well,
also
I'll save those for some other time, but I could show you a whole bunch more things cause dementia.
Okay, yeah. Well, the sugar I want to mention, if it's an isolate without fiber and without water, it's kind of bad too. But there's certain sugars that you can do, right? Like let's say dates or maple syrup or something that it's more whole, I would think, right?
Yeah, those are better. They're more natural. And, sugar is not the main problem. I mean, don't get me wrong, sugar is not a health food, but a little sugar is okay. And McDougall's right when he says, look, let them put a little sugar on their food. It gets them to eat the plant foods. That's what matters, that they eat the plant foods. They avoid the animal foods and the oil. And I think he's right. It makes sense that he's right. And sugar is better. The white table sugar is better than his high fructose corn syrup. I would try to avoid that to the extent I could. A little bit's not a big deal, but I worry about it because quite often it was produced by pumping it through a chloralkali vat, and that would get mercury contamination into the high fructose corn syrup. And they used to call it a preservative, but the joke was it was a preservative because it was contaminated with mercury. But that's not a health food. That's a brain toxin.
Yeah. All right. And then also, do you see that I hear some folks talking that the average lifespan is starting to decrease?
I think it certainly is. They always try to keep the public fooled thinking things are better than they are. But no. I'm telling you, you ask any doctor that works in the hospitals, endless number of train wrecks. How could longevity be going up when the people are fatter and sicker than ever? There's more diabetes and hypertension, coronary artery disease. Coronary artery disease had a little bit of a brief improvement in the early 2000s, but I can tell you this. Like I said, I wouldn't have to look at a chart. I would just know that patient has fatty liver, prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension. And those are the gateway diseases to dementia, to kidney failure, to heart failure, to all these disasters.
Okay.
People are not doing well. They're doing very poorly.
And are you also seeing that dementia as a percentage of just people who are getting that, is that increasing over time as well?
Oh, yeah. Like I said, I have internal medicine doctor friends. They tell me every single one of their patients over 60 years of age they're all stupid. And when they say stupid, they're all cognitively impaired. What I mean by that is because most of them, they got, severe chronic hypertension and diabetes and the atherosclerosis. They're plugging up all the arteries in their brain. How are you going to have a good brain if you plug up the arteries to your brain? And not to mention, I don't really have time, but I could go into, like, if I had to talk about who's stupid, like what groups of patients are the stupidest patients? Okay, number one would be the kidney failure patients because they have a lot of issues. Okay, I won't talk about them anymore. But number two would be the diabetics. Well, actually, I could say the sleep apneics because their brains are hypoxic at night and they lose brain cells and they become stupid. Okay, who else is routinely stupid? My diabetics, because they're often hypoglycemic at night. Plus, they get all kinds of intracranial atherosclerosis, small vessel atherosclerosis. Because you think about it, the heart's in the center of the body. Okay, diabetics are the ones who get the most feet and toes amputated because they get small vessel microvascular disease in the foot. Well, guess what? What's the other thing that's far from the heart? The brain. They get a lot of small vessel intracranial atherosclerosis, and they prevent their brains from getting enough oxygen. And it also, there's other problems too. Insulin resistance doesn't just occur in the periphery of the body, it occurs in the brain. So they can't get enough glucose into their brain cells. So normally, let's say you're walking down a path in a forest or a jungle or prairie, and something happens. There's a bunch of coyotes running near you. You go, uh-oh. A normal person has to go from 0 to 60 miles per hour very quick, ramp up their intellectual cognitive activity. Diabetics can't do that because there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that rely on good glucose uptake into the neurons. And because they got insulin resistance, they just can't do it. So they can't sustain a more high energy phase of cognitive activity. So they're notoriously stupid. And the relevance is the older you get, the more fragile you get. So the more you really should learn about health and get your act together. Otherwise, you're going to end up one of these sick people. And what I'm saying is these diabetics, they'll have a drop in cognitive function, and it's simultaneous with a total drop in bodily energy. And that drop in bodily energy means they no longer have the intellectual oomph and curiosity to learn what they need to learn and to change their behavior and to get well. No, they're just like, oh, well, the doctor said to take my pill. I take my pill. My sugars are not that bad. That's how they kind of are. They're kind of sad. They're sad and pathetic.
Yeah. Well, that's an unfortunate accurate description, I would say, and especially someone like yourself who's practicing. Um, yeah, it's not good. But let me also give you my little take. Again, I'm an optimist, maybe overly optimistic, but I feel like when you get to a certain point and you learn, you're hopefully always learning. I hope that most people want to keep learning, and then you learn that this stuff isn't bad. Is bad. Well, you can always just say, "Well, I'm over 50 now. I did that for 50 years. I don't need to do that anymore." Just I want to make sure that I don't hurt myself, and I would wish that more people would want to do that. And if you're watching this video and you feel that way, comment below too, because we want you guys to hear more about how you can do this. And Dr. Rogers, hopefully some of the things that you've touched on here at the end that we don't have time for, we can do another video in the future about these things.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that an individual can help themselves a tremendous amount if they're willing to make the effort. That's all it takes, but they have to be willing to do that. Most people aren't, but if they are willing to do it, they can help themselves dramatically.
And what you recently said here, the last few sentences before this, you basically described another form of a downward spiral where your motivation gets squashed because you lose your energy, right? And you're losing your cognitive abilities. But that can be reversed if someone wants, hopefully, right? That's the hope
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I was fat in my 30s. I went through a fat phase where I weighed 220 pounds, which is a lot for me. I'm only 5'9". Okay. And it took me about 3-4 years of my own to turn it around. I didn't turn it around until I started an extensive study of nutrition and health. And I became a vegetarian for about 20 years. And then I became a low-fat vegan for the last about 6-7 years. I turned it all around. Okay. And my energy level, the people who know me, it's off the charts. Physical strength is good. Cognitive function is good. And I was worried about, becoming a fat diabetic in my 30s. Now I'm 60 and I'm totally healthy. So I turned it around. Other people could do that too. They just have to make the effort.
Yeah, good job. Well, you're a wonderful example. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep conveying the truth too. That's what we're so appreciative of, because we need to hear this, because that this truth that's being conveyed will help everybody to live just the most enjoyable life possible, right? And that's what we want for people.
Yeah, you give them a chance.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Rogers, and we will
Sure.
see you in the next video.
Sure.